Chapter 121, Harry Potter at Hogwarts. From his top bunk, Ryan could feel a peculiar tension settling over the Ravenclaw dormitory. First, it was Ron and Neville, who hadn't spoken a single word to each other ever since Neville publicly questioned the Chudley Cannon's performance at last weekend's Quidditch match. Then there was Anthony, Terry, and Michael, lightheartedly nicknamed the PC Trio on account of their backgrounds, Jewish, Indian, and Black, who had become eerily inseparable. They walked to meals together, studied side by side in the library, even queued up for the showers as a unit, their soft chatter following them down every corridor. Amid these shifting alliances, one figure stood out more than any other: Harry Potter. The boy who defeated Voldemort as a baby and later expelled Peeves, outwitted Professor Quirrell, and purified the Great Hall's air had quickly become Ravenclaw's undisputed first-year leader. Professor Flitwick praised him in Charms class, Dean Bannon lauded him at breakfast, and even Snape's perpetual sneer had softened into grudging respect. Most astonishing of all, Dumbledore had personally invited Harry to a private lesson, an honor granted to no one else. That rare spotlight drew Anthony in like a magnet. Prefect in the original timeline, he found himself instinctively rallying around Harry's side. Emboldened by Hermione's example, he fired off answers in Charms with newfound gusto, determined not to be outdone by the boy who lived. As friendships realigned and rivalries simmered beneath the surface, Hogwarts prepared to witness yet another chapter in its storied history, and Ryan couldn't wait to see how it would unfold. Anthony fumbled through Professor Sprout's questions. Unlike Hermione, who flew through every answer, he misstepped several times and nearly cost Gryffindor House points. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that his classmates no longer saw him as merely Harry Potter's roommate. Most striking of all was Harry himself. Ever since Anthony's teasing, the chilly standoff between Harry, Ron, and Neville had thawed, and Harry even seemed to be ignoring Anthony's provocations. Even stranger was the new dynamic between Harry and Draco Malfoy. It began in Monday's herbology class. They still weren't friends, but whenever they crossed paths afterward, Harry would be the first to wave, grinning openly, and Malfoy would offer a curt nod in return. Anthony watched the subtle exchanges with fascination. So did Ryan, Anthony's dorm mate, who was lounging on his bed with a bowl of melon. Ryan's bunk was directly beside Harry's, and the thought of Harry changing his feelings about Anthony made Ryan uneasy. He wasn't truly worried about an unwelcome advance, but living next to someone who might suddenly regard you as a potential conquest was disquieting. What unsettled Ryan most, though, was that he'd spun a half-truth, half-lie about himself for both Harry and Hermione to hear. And now Harry was quietly asking if Ryan could bring Ron along next time. Ryan set down his melon, bracing himself for whatever was coming. I can't stay in this dormitory a single minute longer, Ryan thought, though he knew perfectly well that if he asked Harry for help, he'd be turned down flat. Dawn hadn't broken yet, and the castle was still wrapped in silence. It was the quietest time of the day, and the worst time for him. In his previous life, Ryan had time-traveled before even stepping foot in college. He'd never known boarding school living, yet here he was, 11 years old, plunged headlong into its most infamous traditions. He'd pictured the usual eldest brother, second brother pecking order, but Hogwarts dorm life was nothing like the polite hierarchy he'd imagined. Instead, it felt like a cramped, opinionated free-for-all. Ryan buried himself deeper in his blankets. Getting up and waking up were two very different things. Across the narrow room, Ron's bright orange bedspread gleamed in the dim pre-dawn light. His entire side of the chamber was plastered with Chudley Cannon's posters, a player in a vivid orange robe, a cannon soaring overhead, and bold black letters spelling out the team's initials. Ryan guessed Ron had either splurged on them in Diagon Alley or begged his mum to mail them from home. He groaned. The sight of all that orange only reminded him how out of place he felt. If he was stuck here, he vowed at least to make the most of it, or die trying. With a final deep breath, Ryan shoved the covers away and swung his legs over the side of the bed. Time to face another day in the world's quirkiest boarding house. Honestly, Ron's room in the original book was even more extreme. Every surface screamed bright orange-yellow, from the bedspread and walls to the ceiling itself. It was nothing short of visual pollution. Ryan turned away from the garish decor and peered out the window. Instantly, his usual moonlit irises narrowed into silvery white slits, animal pupils sharpening the view. A mischievous niffler was busy sipping dew from the twin-tipped grass, completely oblivious to the eight-eyed acromantula crouched just behind it. With a single thought, Ryan's gaze incinerated the spider into ash. The niffler never even noticed. Hagrid truly doted on Aragog's descendants, but in magical biology the acromantula ranked as invasive species. Were it not for the centaurs, both their hunting parties and their solemn oaths of protection, the Forbidden Forest would long ago have fallen into chaos. The centaurs, proudly self-appointed guardians of those tangled woods, knew its balance better than anyone. Ryan lingered at the window until a barn owl swooped in, dropping a rolled copy of the Daily Prophet onto his desk. Here it came again. Fresh headlines, fresh distractions, and another day unfolding at Hogwarts. Harry Potter at Hogwarts, A Stranger's Welcome, by Rita Skeeter, Special Correspondent. First, allow me to apologize to my dear readers for the delay in releasing this report. Rest assured, it is not due to any lack of speed on my part. I am, after all, famously swift with a quill. In my previous exposé, I fearlessly laid bare young Harry Potter's miserable childhood and exposed what I called Dumbledore's plan. Yet, for reasons that remain shrouded in mystery, and at the insistence of a certain powerful individual, I was forced to postpone publication. Ironically, that very pressure has produced this article, complete with fresh evidence that I guarantee you won't find anywhere else. Harry Potter, this boy whom the wizarding world hails as special, has endured pains common to all adolescents. Orphaned at an early age and subjected to the daily cruelties of his Muggle relatives, 11-year-old Harry believed he had finally found a safe harbor at Hogwarts. There, among enchanted staircases and talking portraits, he found true comfort in his loyal friend Ronald Weasley, the youngest son of a devoted Dumbledore household. Yet Harry could not have foreseen that, even in this magical refuge, his fragile heart would soon suffer another, far more unexpected trial. Here's a cleaned-up idiomatic rewrite that preserves every twist and turn of the original. Since being sorted into Ravenclaw, Weasley, an otherwise unremarkable boy with a surprisingly burning passion, has discovered that Harry alone can no longer sate his appetite. Instead, he's been falling head over heels for his roommate, Neville Longbottom. Even Mr. Weasley has gleefully toyed with both boys' emotions, and Neville, clearly enchanted by Weasley's clever charm, hasn't stood a chance. Last Saturday's escapade into Diagon Alley was the talk of the castle. Weasley invited both families on a double date, then sealed the evening's romance by gifting Neville a matching unicorn hair wand. As you might expect, word spread like fiend fire. According to several anonymous Hogwarts students, the pair haven't exchanged a single word in over a week. Meanwhile, Harry Potter, once so disinterested in girls thanks to his cousin Dudley's influence and the ever-venerable headmaster, now appears to have finally understood his own heart. I was the first to know. Potter! I ought to be his friend! Draco Malfoy blurted out to Dudley, whose own orientation was, rather surprisingly, revealed by the Sorting Hat this term. Harry, clutching a stack of Charms homework, happened upon the scene in the corridor and watched, wide-eyed, as Malfoy made his earnest declaration. And the pièce de résistance? Neville and Weasley reportedly made things official during Monday's herbology class, exchanging vows in front of Professor Sprout and the entire class of third years. Let's all send our warmest congratulations to Hogwarts' newest married couple. Rita Skeeter's latest exposé is nothing if not provocative. Despite the Malfoys' efforts to keep their private affairs under wraps, she insists that Draco Malfoy's feelings run deep, and by contrast, Ronnie Weasley's do not. According to Skeeter, Ronald is little more than a pawn of the mysterious White Wizard, compelled by an irresistible decree to do his bidding. What's more, Skeeter tantalizingly speculates that Arthur Weasley's true allegiance may lie not with his own son, but with Neville Longbottom. Bound by obligations too powerful to refuse, Weasley can only serve humbly in the shadows. If there is any truth to these whispers, she pleads with Mr. Longbottom to forgive his friend. After all, they both wield wands strung with unicorn tail hair, and that bond ought to count for something. Next week, confidential revelations. Trust me, you don't want to know. My safety depends on keeping it under wraps. Reading this, Ryan can't help but grin. Only Rita Skeeter, he muses, would have the nerve to skewer the good families while tiptoeing around the real power players. Had she gone after Cornelius Fudge or, heaven forbid, Voldemort, she'd have vanished by breakfast. Yet she's taken aim at Draco Malfoy? Brilliantly bold. And by dangling next week's headline, she's silenced Lucius Malfoy before he can do her any harm. Even better, Dumbledore himself will see to her protection. Now that's the kind of twist only Rita Skeeter could dream up. Harry Potter's Wednesday began, as always, with the Daily Prophet. He disliked the paper. He'd long ago learned to take its stories with a grain of salt, but habit had him skimming it every morning after washing up. Reading the Prophet, misleading as it often was, kept him connected to the wider wizarding world. That said, he refused to subscribe. Why bankroll the very publication that delighted in smearing his name? Lately, borrowing a copy from his dormmates had become a headache. Anthony Goldstein, Michael, and Terry all carried a streak of vanity. Michael was the showiest, Terry a close second, and Anthony quietly prideful. Harry wasn't about to ask Anthony for his paper, especially since the Goldstein name was suddenly everywhere thanks to Tina, and Anthony seemed touchier than usual. This morning, though, Harry rubbed his eyes in surprise. A fresh Daily Prophet lay waiting on his nightstand, neatly creased and still warm from delivery. It wasn't Anthony's copy. Harry knew because he was the only one in the dorm with a subscription. Whoever sent it hadn't signed their name, but Harry didn't need a byline to know that. For once, the morning news had found its way right to him. Ryan slid the parchment across the table. "Harry, it's yours." "All right, let me see," Harry said, leaning forward. The moment he laid eyes on it, he let out a high-pitched scream. Ron, who'd just finished washing up in the sink behind him, spun around in alarm. Without even pausing to think, he joined in with a gut-wrenching yell. Neville, who'd been hovering a safe 2 meters away, rushed over, and his cry was the most prolonged of the lot, first startled, then desperate. Anthony Diggory's trio emerged from the common room at the commotion. For a moment, everyone's petty rivalries vanished. They clustered around Harry, all of them sharing the same mix of shock and indignation. When their lungs finally gave out, curses poured out in a torrent, insults none of them usually dared speak aloud. "Blasted thing," Ron spat. "I've complained before, but this is too much. They got my very name wrong." Harry and Neville exchanged astonished glances. Ron's outrage was on a whole other level. They'd barely had time to stay angry at him before they remembered why they were furious in the first place. By the time they'd each taken turns ranting and swearing, they'd lost track of everything else, including their early morning transfiguration class. Standing there, red-faced and breathless, they realized they'd just wasted far more time fuming than the few moments it would take to sort out this ridiculous mess. Most of the other first years, who'd planned to come to Transfiguration with Harry and his mysterious Peeves repeller, had already hurried off to class. Ron, Harry, Hermione, Ryan, and the rest, however, clung to their usual habit of rising early, yet still arrived in Professor McGonagall's classroom on the first floor with mere seconds to spare before the bell rang. They practically stumbled through the door, breathless and tangled in their robes. To their astonishment, Professor McGonagall looked up from her desk and said crisply, "Don't worry, I understand why you're late today." The 5 friends exchanged incredulous glances. It was clear the stern Transfiguration professor had been scanning the Daily Prophet each morning. She'd spotted the article about Harry's Peeves repeller and recognized their predicament. Panting, they managed a chorus of grateful thank yous and slid into the back row. Ryan, of course, was momentarily forgotten until he awkwardly claimed the last free seat beside Hermione. As McGonagall resumed her lecture, she surveyed the classroom. A few of the first years who'd never heard about the repeller looked puzzled, their attention fused on the professor's wand. And those in the know, having seen today's prophet, wore equally inscrutable expressions, each lost in thoughts they dared not share aloud. Slowly, the room settled into an expectant hush, ready at last for the day's first Transfiguration lesson. Professor McGonagall tapped her wand against the edge of her desk, drawing the chatter in the Transfiguration classroom to a hush. "If you haven't finished today's reading," she said, her sharp eyes sweeping the room, "you'll find it difficult to follow our lesson." She paused, then added more quietly, Rita Skeeter's new article about Harry Potter appeared this morning. I'm reliably informed it's riddled with baseless rumors and sensationalism. A few Ravenclaws exchanged uneasy glances. I trust you all know better than to take every word of the prophet at face value. Once you've seen the piece for yourselves, I expect you'll dismiss any suspicions it tries to sow among you. She straightened her robes and addressed the class evenly. Now, Transfiguration demands your full attention. One slip of concentration can lead to unfortunate results. Professor McGonagall tapped a nearby stack of parchments. Today, we're going back to fundamentals. These rules of Transfiguration have been distilled from centuries of countless failures and a fair number of spectacular successes. Understanding them is the key to reliable casting. Lisa Dupin raised her hand. Professor, will there be a practical component today? McGonagall shook her head. Not this lesson, I'm afraid. We'll focus purely on theory. If you prefer wand work, I suggest you review your notes on everyday practice. Not everyone has mastered match-to-needle transfiguration yet. A hand shot up at the back. Besides Miss Granger, who has? There's a handful, McGonagall conceded with a small smile. But it remains a challenging exercise. For now, prepare your quills and parchments. We begin with the principle of conjunction. As students leaned forward, quills poised, the door at the back of the classroom creaked open, though no one seemed to notice, engrossed in the pioneer cases of transfiguration theory. If you've done the preparation for today's lesson, you'll already know what we're covering, Professor McGonagall began, pacing slowly in front of the class. I spoke of 5 key exceptions to Gamp's fundamental law of transfiguration. She paused at the front row, ensuring every student was following along, quill in hand. Then she raised her voice slightly. First, food. No witch or wizard can summon a gourmet meal from nothing, nor can you turn pebbles into prime rib. Even if the newly formed dish looks and smells perfectly edible, it contains no nourishment. Eating it will only leave you with indigestion, or worse. That said, you can take food that already exists and alter its form or increase its size. And for your benefit, the meals you enjoy here at Hogwarts are not conjured on your plates. The house elves prepare everything in the kitchens, then send it directly to the dining hall by way of the relocation spell. She paused to glance around. Every student was feverishly writing notes. Second, the transformation of living things. You cannot effect a permanent change between living and inanimate objects. Yes, you could turn a button into a beetle, but only temporarily. Once the magic fades, it will revert to a button. No spell can grant that beetle infinite life or movement. The moment the enchantment dissipates, the original form reasserts itself. Furthermore, Professor McGonagall said, even if you transfigure a button into a beetle that looks, moves, and wriggles exactly like the real thing, it remains a button at its core. Offer it to a hungry bird, and it won't satisfy the creature's hunger. It will choke on it. With that grim illustration, she underlined the first rule. You cannot transfigure inedible objects into genuine food. Third, there are strict limits to what transfiguration can achieve. It cannot create true magical artifacts. That requires the subtle work of alchemy. Think of our self-inking quills, our self-stirring cauldrons, even the galleons in your pockets, all wrought by fairies. Those items never tarnish, resist damage, and can even recognize and count themselves. And fourth, she continued, transfiguration cannot alter the quantity of matter. You cannot turn a single table into 2 cats, nor collapse 3 quills into 1 fork. The only exception is when separate parts have been magically bonded into a single inseparable whole, like the links of a chain. In that case, you may change the chain as one object and then revert it, and its links will remain properly attached. Professor McGonagall paused, surveying her students to ensure the limits of alchemical and quantitative transfiguration had sunk in before proceeding to the next topic. If I were to transform Mr. Ron Weasley, clothed as he is, into an eagle, then revert him to human form, his garments would not reattach like feathers, Professor McGonagall explained. She paused and quirked an eyebrow, adding a wry comment only those who'd read that morning's Daily Prophet would catch. Finally, and most importantly, we must remember the limits of transfiguration. You cannot create something from nothing. You may have seen older students wave their wands and seemingly conjure flocks of birds or bouquets of flowers. Those, however, are not true transfigurations. Such creations are either temporary magical projections summoned by spells or objects transformed and concealed, perhaps folded up small enough to hide in a palm, until released. True transfiguration always works with pre-existing matter. It merely changes its shape or form. By 11 o'clock, the lesson was over. Even after assigning homework, Professor McGonagall remained behind her desk, tidying her notes. As soon as the other students rose, they flocked around Harry, peppering him with questions about every detail of the report he'd delivered. Chapter 123, Owl Expo. At 11:05 a.m., Harry found himself completely hemmed in by a sea of eager classmates, the same students he passed on the corridors every day. Ron shot him an apologetic look. He couldn't very well barge through them without causing a scene. Inside the classroom, Fred and George Weasley were oddly posted at the door, quelling the crowd with a clutch of tiny, chittering creatures. "George! Fred! What on earth are you two doing with those beasts?" Professor McGonagall demanded as she swept into the room. "I wasn't aware you took to transfiguration quite so enthusiastically." The twins grinned and stepped aside. "Sorry, Professor. These little ones escaped our control," George said, scooping up one critter under his robes. "But if we hurry, we can still grab good seats in the auditorium before lunch." With McGonagall's stern presence clearing the way, Harry and his friends finally broke free. Yet by the time they reached the auditorium, they realized lunch was only the opening act. Ron was already unpacking his tray. "Harry, eat quickly," he urged. "Then let's head back to the common room before things get too, well, let's just say interesting." Neville nodded fervently, and Hermione began arranging her sampler plates with her usual precision. Harry was about to dive into his sandwich when a strange rustling rippled through the hall. He looked up and froze. Owls, dozens of them, were swooping down from the rafters, wings beating in unison. They alighted on benches and tables, finally descending upon Ron's tray in a flutter of talons and hoots. Panic erupted. Students leapt from their seats, clattering trays and scattering roast beef. Neville yelped as a snowy owl tugged at his pudding, and Hermione ducked just in time to avoid a swooping screech owl. "Everyone, remain calm," McGonagall's voice rang out as she barged in, blowing a sharp note on her silver whistle. "This is the annual Owl Breeders' Showcase. Please cover your lunches and stay exactly where you are." Amid the chaos of flapping wings and startled gasps, Harry glared at his barely touched sandwich. He caught Ron's eye, who was dusting bacon crumbs off his robes. "Quick lunch, then straight to the lounge," Harry suggested grimly. Ron nodded. "Best plan I've heard all morning." Harry cracked a small smile. "Agreed." And with that, they turned back to their trays, bracing themselves for an onslaught of feathers. In less than 10 minutes, Ron's breakfast table was swamped with owls of every description: snowy owls, pied-headed owls, red-horned owls, little striped owls, and even the ubiquitous Eurasian eagle owls, perched side by side, each clinging to his bench or fluttering about in a frantic dance of wings and hoots. He glanced to his right. The Slytherin table was in exactly the same chaotic state. Draco Malfoy glared at the commotion, but the flood of birds seemed unstoppable. Ron pinched the bridge of his nose and reached for the smallest owl, its head feathered in pink blossoms, and pried from its leg a ragged envelope. His cheeks burned as he tore it open. "What on earth?" he muttered. "This is ridiculous." He shoved the note toward Harry. Harry recognized it at once as a ransom-style message, the letters cut from the pages of Wizarding Weekly. He read aloud, "You are a bad boy. Harry Potter deserves better friends. Go back to your precious Ottery St. Catchpole." Ron's hands shook as he opened the next envelope. "Listen to this," he snapped, voice cracking. "Harry Potter deserves 100 times better friend than you. You should be boiled up in a toad's egg." He paused, staring at the jagged letters. "Cook it? What kind of—" "Who would do this?" Harry asked quietly, scanning the owls all around them. "And why send it to you?" Ron glared at the assembled birds as if daring them to answer. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I swear, whoever's behind this, if I ever find them." Before he could finish, another owl swooped in, clinging to the edge of his parchment with a fresh letter pinned to its leg. Ron braced himself and broke the seal. His face paled. "Harry, They've sent 3 more. Harry leaned over to read. The great hall, once filled with the morning chatter of students catching up after the weekend, fell eerily silent around them. The 2 friends exchanged a troubled look. Whoever was sending these cruel messages had a grievance against Ron, and they clearly didn't intend to stop anytime soon. Oh no. The moment Ron slit open the last envelope, a geyser of yellow-green slime shot onto his hands, filling the air with a sharp, gasoline-like stench. Almost instantly, angry yellow blisters bubbled up across his skin. Undiluted boobatuber pus? Fred gasped. He'd seen all the letters scattered on the table and rushed over, but he hadn't been quick enough to stop Ron. Carefully, Fred picked up the envelope, sniffed at its edge, and shuddered. From the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was already barking orders. He'd sent Crabbe and Goyle scrambling for dragonhide gloves to investigate each poisoned missive. Malfoy himself remained pale, yet his lips curved into an unmistakable sneer as he watched the chaos unfold. "Bloody hell!" Ron yelped, tears in his eyes. He pressed a crumpled napkin to his hands, but it only smeared pus across his fingers, which by now had swollen into thick, knobbly welts. Every motion sent fresh pain shooting up his arms. "Harry, go tell Professor Flitwick what's going on during charms this afternoon," George said, all business. He laid a steadying hand on Ron's shoulder. "I'll get him to the hospital wing." With a quick flick of his wand, George muttered, "Petrificus totalis," only he directed it at the offending letters. Instantly, they stiffened as though turned to stone, sealing away any more of that corrosive ooze. "Come on, mate," he added softly, guiding a wincing Ron toward the exit. Harry dashed off toward Professor Flitwick's classroom, letters in hand, while Fred and Hermione exchanged anxious glances. Across the Great Hall, the Slytherins watched with smug satisfaction, until Malfoy's expression faltered at the sight of Ron's bloodied palms. Moments later, Madame Pomfrey bustled over, sharp eyes taking in Ron's blistered hands. By the time Harry arrived with Professor Flitwick, Ron was already halfway to a healing potion. "Well done," Flitwick murmured appreciatively as he examined the sealed letters. "You may have just prevented a far worse disaster." Fred gave a small, relieved grin, but his eyes were still fixed on the petrified pile of letters. Whoever had sent those envelopes would be in for trouble, once Ron had fully recovered. Ryan whispered the seldom-used incantation for corporeal levitation, better known in the castle as zombie float. The prefect at the front of the corridor jerked upright and hovered a good foot off the ground, arms flailing like a puppet. Fred and Percy flanked him immediately, eager to seize their chance. Penello, caught off guard, froze in mid-step. As a prefect, he'd never needed to dodge spells at this speed, and Percy, barely more than a junior himself, lagged behind. Penello offered Ryan a strained, awkward smile, then spun toward Kate as if nothing had happened. "Lovely morning, isn't it?" he said. Kate didn't even look his way. She still smarted from last weekend, when Ryan had invited her on that mysterious outing to Atlantis, only to cancel at the last minute and send her off with Harry and Hermione instead. Kate's cold refusal to meet Penello's gaze said everything. A slow grin spread across Ryan's face. It was time to deploy his secret weapon, the intricate mental strategy game he'd been perfecting in his mind all morning. Today's match was going to be his masterpiece. Harry and Neville, forks frozen over their breakfast plates, exchanged baffled glances. Whispers and curious stares from nearby tables left them with no appetite. They each grabbed a roll, tucked it into a pocket of their robes, and hurried off toward Ravenclaw Tower, determined to see what Ryan had planned next. It was 1:15 in the afternoon, just minutes before Charms class, when Harry Poe, Tatter, and Neville Longbottom burst from the Gryffindor dormitory and dashed up to the 4th floor. Other first-years hurried past them, undeterred by the ever-mischievous Peeves, keen to make the final bell. A second later, the familiar chime rang through the corridors, and the 2 friends slipped into Professor Flitwick's classroom, hearts pounding. "Don't worry," Flitwick called out with a kindly smile. "I can excuse your lateness today." Professor McGonagall, perched sternly at the back, nodded in agreement. Relief should have washed over Harry and Neville, but instead, both wore looks of pained disappointment, especially Neville. As the only Longbottom heir, he'd half hoped his formidable grandmother Augusta would arrive at Hogwarts by midday to keep a watchful eye on him. But despite her promise, she had not appeared. What Neville didn't know was that McGonagall, well aware of his grandmother's brand of tough love, had intercepted a message just this morning and gently persuaded Augusta Longbottom that her grandson would be quite safe without her presence at the castle. Only then did the indomitable grandmother relent. Still, Harry could see the tension in Neville's shoulders. Even with today's reprieve, Neville Longbottom sensed, and Harry did, too, that the week ahead would challenge them both as never before. Harry sat in Charm's class, his thoughts drifting back to Ron, still waiting in anxious silence at the burrow, wondering if any owl would ever arrive. He couldn't shake the image of Ron, staring at an empty hearth, convinced he'd been forgotten. Somewhere in the recesses of Harry's mind, he imagined Ryan, the quiet strategist who seemed to be pulling strings behind the scenes, overseeing every twist and turn of his story. A sharp tap on the desk snapped Harry back to reality. Professor Flitwick, his wand poised like a conductor's baton, cleared his throat. "By the way," he began, eyes twinkling beneath his bushy eyebrows, "I've already heard about Ron's predicament." Harry sat bolt upright, curiosity and relief warring on his face. "Today," Flitwick continued, "we embark on learning the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa. To master it, you first need to understand its two-component spells, Levioso, which raises an object into the air, and Locomotor, which moves that object at your command. When cast together, Wingardium Leviosa, the result is a graceful, responsive lift that follows your intent." He glanced at the classroom clock. "Now, today is September 11th, 1991. I expect all of you to have this charm under your belts before Halloween, October 31st. Flitwick's expression turned more serious. "One more thing. Earlier today, one of the Weasley twins demonstrated the Mobila Corpus incantation. It's certainly useful for shifting a body from place to place, but let me be clear. It makes no distinction between a conscious or unconscious subject. Do not use it on another person without explicit permission and a justifiable reason." A hush fell over the students as the professor signaled it was time to practice. Harry exhaled, jotting down every detail. The levitation charm awaited, and with it, the promise of new challenges and, hopefully, a letter for Ron at the next post. Professor Flitwick cleared his throat. "Today's spell is Mobila Corpus, pronounced Mo-bil-corpus." Harry frowned. He was certain he'd heard Flitwick expressly forbid the use of that incantation, yet here the tiny professor was, walking them through every step in detail. Ryan leaned in. "That's Ravenclaw for you," he murmured. "Knowledge itself isn't wrong. If Dumbledore had been teaching this, he'd have mentioned it once in passing and left it at that." Harry still looked unconvinced. "But he did tell us never to use it." Ryan shrugged. "True, but Dumbledore trusts we'll think for ourselves. He doesn't hide things from us. He gives us the tools and lets us decide how to use them." Chapter 124, The Crowded School Clinic. Harry sat frozen at his desk in Charm's class when Ryan spoke aloud. His voice was clear and surprisingly assured, young yet compelling, and although it wasn't high-pitched, every word rang true. What really startled Harry, however, was that no one else in the room, even Professor Flitwick, seemed to hear him. This wasn't the usual telepathic whisper in Harry's mind. It had been actual sound, fully audible to Harry's ears alone. Up until that moment, Harry had been awestruck by Ryan's display of magic. But now he realized there was something deeper in Ryan's words, an impossible claim about Dumbledore. The venerable headmaster was, after all, the greatest white wizard alive, the authority on every enchantment and hex. And yet Ryan had just suggested that even Dumbledore couldn't unravel a certain family curse. Harry's mind wandered back to an overheard snippet from earlier that day, when Lisa Dupin and Hermione were talking by the fountain. "I dare say only people in my family truly understand this curse," Lisa had whispered, "and even Professor Dumbledore doesn't fully grasp it." Before Harry could digest the implication, Ron leaned over, more curious than polite, and blurted out, "Lisa, what is this curse you keep talking about?" Across the hall, the bell rang, herding students toward their next class. But for Harry, and for anyone who had just heard Ryan's inexplicable words, the rest of the school day suddenly seemed far more urgent. Determined to learn more, Harry made his way toward the school clinic, now packed with students lining up for Madame Pomfrey's attention. Whatever secrets Ryan was guarding, and whatever dread curse Lisa's family bore, Harry felt certain the answers would soon surface. Ron Weasley was hardly the picture of a model student. Homework often slipped through the cracks, but he took his odd little hobbies with utmost seriousness. He chased down every chocolate frog card he didn't own, scoured the corridors for new Chudley Cannon's posters from Charlie's latest trip, and lately he'd been pestering Lisa so relentlessly that she finally dashed back to the girls' dormitory just to get away from him. At long last, Ron cornered her in the corridor and demanded an answer. Blushing furiously, Lisa admitted that she'd inherited a strange family charm, a curse passed from mother to daughter, and unusually handed off to a son when the girls tired of it. Its supposed purpose? To banish acne. "Ron, what on earth are you playing at?" Harry Potter asked, leaning over Ron's shoulder. He suspected some muffling jinx had been cast on them. He hadn't heard Lisa's secret confession until Ron was practically shouting in his ear. "Harry, if you really want to know what's got him so spun up, you have my permission to investigate, on one condition," Professor Flitwick said abruptly, approaching the boys. "You'll have to make up for the lesson you miss in your free time." Harry opened his mouth, but Flitwick held up a hand. "However, the rumors circulating thanks to Rita Skeeter have already tied you to Mr. Weasley in some sensational scandal. If you start poking around, it'll only get worse." Flitwick's eyes were kind but firm. "I'd advise against it." Harry glanced at Ron, whose face was a study in stubborn determination. Whatever this acne-clearing curse was, Ron wasn't about to let it go quietly, and Harry had a feeling he'd soon be right in the middle of it. Professor Flitwick looked at Harry with a knowing smile. "The best way to kill a rumor isn't to deny it at every turn, but to treat it as if it's a joke. If you don't give it any importance, everyone else will lose interest before long." Harry had meant to admit that his own carelessness, not anything Ron did, had caused the misunderstanding. But Flitwick's words scattered his thoughts, and all he managed was a flustered nod. "Very good, Harry," said Flitwick, perching atop a stack of textbooks. "I must admit, I never expected one of my students to teach me a thing or two about rumor control. Now, off you go, and don't forget to stop by later." "Right," Harry murmured, caught off balance. He glanced at Ryan, who was lounging by the window, idly leafing through a thick book of charms. His posture was casual, almost indifferent, yet the faint curve of his lips betrayed just how entertained he was by the whole exchange. Harry knew Ryan had that uncanny knack for slipping in and out of Hogwarts unnoticed, a skill that could prove invaluable tonight. But Ryan made no move to follow. With a resigned sigh, Harry slung his satchel over his shoulder and gave Ryan's arm a gentle tug. "Come on," he said. "Let's get going." Neville rose from his desk and offered, "Harry, I'll carry your things over to Defense Against the Dark Arts for you." Harry managed a grateful smile. He knew lingering any longer would draw suspicion. He risked being accused of disrupting Professor Flitwick's charms lesson. Rather than press his luck, he nodded politely, gathered his books, and slipped out without looking back. Across the room, Ryan watched Harry go with a curious glint in his eye. Even now, with Harry physically gone, Ryan felt as though the boy were still somewhere in Hogwarts, somehow keeping him under that same quiet vigilance. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What does that make me?" he wondered. "Some long-lost ancestor I've never met." With that musing tucked away, the perspective shifted back to Harry. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and made his way to the school nurse's office, seeking Madame Pomfrey's help with a nagging headache. But when he arrived, he found the waiting area empty. He sat down on a hard wooden bench and stared at the closed doors, tapping his fingers against his robes. Minutes stretched by. Growing impatient, Harry rose and headed back toward the stairwell. On the third floor, a corridor of student dormitories and storage closets, he paused at the landing. His eyes drifted upward to the locked door at the end of the fourth-floor corridor, the entrance to the forbidden section of the library. Before he could resist the familiar urge to peek, the heavy oak door swung open. Professor Quirrell stepped out, his face drained almost white. The usual nervous stutter and cringing demeanor were gone, replaced by an expression so sudden and fierce that Harry froze mid-step. Quirrell glanced around as if he expected someone, or something, to be right behind him, then shut the door and hurried down the stairs, leaving Harry standing in the shadowed corridor, more puzzled than ever. Harry stared at the empty spot where the man had been. His face vanished again, as if it had never existed. He rubbed his eyes in bafflement, then realized the staircase had shifted once more and would take a few moments to reappear. When the stairway finally returned, Harry climbed to the second floor and stepped into a scene that made him blink in astonishment. Dozens of students, mostly witches, had abandoned their lessons. Even more unbelievable, the usual rivalries had vanished. Gryffindors and Slytherins chatted together. Ravenclaws laughed arm in arm with Hufflepuffs. It was as if house divisions had been temporarily erased. Harry paused, trying to process it all. I knew it. It has to be you, Harry Potter. A Slytherin girl he recognized pushed through the crowd. Her normally haughty, icy expression had softened into something almost adoring, like a die-hard cat lover who'd just discovered she wasn't allergic after all. Where's Neville? Why isn't he here? From somewhere nearby came a sharp whispered retort. Honestly, Draco, must you go making a scene, and in the middle of class no less? Harry watched, half amused, as the two exchanged annoyed glances. Whatever was happening here, it had everyone's attention, Slytherin and Gryffindor alike. And for once, the Great Hall's house rivalries felt like a distant memory. Harry Potter lingered hesitantly outside the infirmary, his bag slung over one shoulder. Down the corridor came a rising tide of voices, laughter, whispers, and teasing. 4 neat clusters of girls, each representing a errant house, had formed a blockade. Look at him. Potter even skipped class to see Ron. What a coward. I believe in love again. If Dumbledore weren't such an old madman, their relationship would be so much purer. I'm sure Ron's feelings for Harry are real. Neville? He's just a blubbering drama queen playing the helpless friend to get Ron's sympathy. They're perfect for each other. And if Ron's that tall, does Harry have to stand on his tiptoes to kiss him? Ah, you're impossible, but I adore you for it. What? Ron's with Neville, Harry's with Malfoy, and you're a Ravenclaw. Why are you sounding like a Hufflepuff? A short, plump Hufflepuff girl bristled. What's wrong with Hufflepuffs? At least we're not rabid Gryffindor lionesses. The Gryffindors retorted in kind. And what's wrong with us? You're a pitiful bunch of Slytherins. Frozen in place, Harry dared not take another step. The hallway had devolved into a skirmish of house rivalries, Gryffindors against Slytherins, Ravenclaws against Hufflepuffs, each side trading barbs faster than spells. Suddenly, the infirmary door burst open. Okay, ladies, make way, please. Fred Weasley emerged, arms full of bandages and bottles, his trademark grin breaking through the chaos. At his call, the girls scrambled aside. Harry exhaled, grateful for the path Fred had carved, and finally crossed the threshold into the infirmary. George stepped forward, calling out, "We've come to collect our sister-in-law." Almost as if on command, the gathered students murmured and politely parted, creating a clear path. In the next instant, the Weasley twins each grabbed one of Harry's arms and whisked him toward the school infirmary. Honestly, Harry, you're mad, one twin panted. If you hadn't barged in just now, we'd still be stuck back there. Harry managed a short laugh. Did you see how compliant they all were, Fred? The twin Fred, or was it George, smiled. Actually, I'm George, he corrected. They were simply intrigued by the idea of their new sister-in-law. And let's be honest, we do have a bit of a reputation here at Hogwarts. Chapter 125, Rita Skeeter Sick. By 2:30 that afternoon, the infirmary was quiet. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows and fell across Ron's motionless form. He was still completely petrified, more a statue of stone than a boy. Harry hovered at the foot of the bed, staring in frustration. Fred, why didn't Madame Pomfrey send? Harry began, then stopped cold as 2 familiar voices interrupted him. Oh, all right, fine. I admit it, said one of them, tossing back an errant lock of red hair. I'm Fred, Harry. What are you doing here? Yeah, Harry. How did you guess it was us? Piped up the other, grinning. I'm George. Harry folded his arms, a little smug. I've noticed that between you two, Fred always talks first. Fred and George exchanged triumphant looks. Harry's expression grew serious again. Where is Madame Pomfrey now? Fred shrugged. She said that at first she planned to simply wrap Ron's injury in bandages soaked with the juice of those white blossoms she found outside. But then she saw the extent of the damage. He's completely petrified, and realized he'll need his wand for the next couple of lessons. George here argued that a thick bandage would limit him too much, so rather than let him stay wrapped up, she dashed off to Professor Sprout's greenhouse to fetch some fresh mustard flowers. She's got a clever little remedy in mind. George nodded. By this afternoon, Ron's hand should be back to normal, they reckon. Harry exhaled, relieved. He glanced at the statue-like shape on the bed. With any luck, Madame Pomfrey's new treatment would work just as she promised, and Ron would be out of his stone shell by dinner. George winced as he massaged his temple. This method is agonizing and keeps him completely immobilized. We'll have to stay here and reapply Petrificus Totalis to our little brother every so often. Fred frowned. And it gets worse. Since Madame Pomfrey was called away, a group of people showed up asking for you, Neville or Malfoy. Harry's eyes lit up. I see. George, do you know a Ravenclaw named Kate Lewinster? George exchanged a knowing look with Fred. So that's it. Harry leaned forward. What are you talking about? Fred shrugged. The only witch capable of targeting all 4 houses at once and petrifying them is Rita Skeeter's former protégé in Ravenclaw. George added, they say she even managed to silence Rita herself. No one dares cross her. Harry ran a hand through his hair. How did you track her down? We started digging when Percy made his move last year, Fred explained. Eventually, we zeroed in on Kate Lewinster. George nodded. Believe me, she's dangerous. In perfect unison, the twins grumbled, and you can thank Percy for that. Harry slumped against the bedpost. Fantastic. So why did I end up on her bad side? At the door, Ryan, still in his charms robes, snorted with laughter. Calm down, Harry. Who told you you were the one to light this fire? Although Ryan was partly to blame, Kate just needed to let off steam. She'll calm down soon. Thanks for stepping in for me, Harry. Across the table, George chimed in. Believe me, it's already a big deal on its own. Kate's only been the messenger. She hasn't fanned the flames. She just made sure the right people heard about it. Mad. Pomfrey's away at the moment, so you can bet she'll come see you as soon as she's back. Really, Kate was just blowing off steam, Fred added. She's not that upset. Harry, you're probably taking it more seriously than she intended. I still think you'd be better off not going after her, Fred said. You don't know how fierce she can be. It's awkward enough when a boy goes looking for trouble with a girl. Harry frowned. You're just guessing. I don't have any proof she won't lash out. She's thick as thieves with your prefect, Penelope, George reminded him. They do everything together. They're inseparable, Fred agreed. Remember how Percy couldn't stop chasing after Penelope? Kate gave him such a hard time for it. The way he went about it was all wrong anyway. George concluded, dead with a grin. Served him right. Just then, Madame Pomfrey returned to the corridor, and the cluster of students who had gathered around her quietly slipped away. Madame Pomfrey waved Fred and George back toward their classroom, then turned her sharp gaze on Harry. To everyone's surprise, Harry was allowed to stay until Ron was fully recovered. Very well, she said, peering at Harry over her spectacles. You must be Neville, according to my file. Harry blinked. I'm Harry Potter, he told her, trying to hide his astonishment. His father's face was nearly identical to his own. How could she not recognize him? Madame Pomfrey tapped her clipboard absently. She was notorious for her strict routines. She seldom left the castle during the week and rarely bothered to remember faces unless they belonged to someone truly important in her eyes. To a proud Slytherin alumna like herself, the leader of Gryffindor's infamous marauders was hardly more than a curious footnote. It appears Rita Skeeter's conjectures were entirely off the mark, she announced, smacking her plush lower lip in disapproval. There is no hidden connection, familial or otherwise, between Neville Longbottom and Ronald Weasley, as she so persistently claimed. Harry forced himself to remain silent. She clearly thought he was Neville, unaware that he was someone else entirely. All right, Mr. Potter, Mr. Longbottom, she corrected herself. Please step over here. He managed a wry half-smile. And if I'm eager to get back on my feet quickly, what should I do? Her expression softened, just a touch. Active rest, a couple of light restorative potions, and compliance with my orders. Lie back and relax. I'll have you healed up in no time. Harry settled onto the bed, grateful that Ron would be back on his feet soon, but inwardly resolved to remind Madame Pomfrey who he really was the next time she glanced his way. Madame Pomfrey hadn't attempted anything like this since her days at St. Mungo's decades ago. She drew back one of the bedside curtains and hung the white cloth across it, casting a small shadow over Ron's hospital bed. A hush settled in the ward. Everyone seemed afraid Harry might catch an unpleasant glimpse. "Poor Ron," Pomfrey murmured. She cracked the curtain open just enough for Harry to lean in. "Would you be a dear and pass me that cloth by his head? But whatever you do, don't look. If you see what I'm about to reveal, you'll lose your appetite for dinner." Harry glanced at the cloth, then at Ron's motionless form. "Madame Pomfrey, couldn't I just—" he began, thinking a simple "scourgify" might suffice. "Not yet," she interrupted gently. "Cover his eyes, please." When he was petrified, they were fixed downward, staring straight at his own hands. "I can't let him see them like that." Harry obeyed, draping the cloth over Ron's face, and Pomfrey pulled the curtain shut. Inside, she worked quickly, old remedies, focused charms, until 10 minutes later she drew the curtain back. The workbench was spotless thanks to a swift cleaning charm, and Ron lay free of petrification at last. His eyes fluttered open. He looked around, sluggish and embarrassed, but miraculously, his hands were entirely restored. Madame Pomfrey bustled back into the room with a steaming pot of tea just as Ron's eyes fluttered open. Harry couldn't resist commenting. "When you draped that white cloth over your head, Ron, it reminded me of a morgue." Ron sat up with a frown. "A mortuary? You mean like the place muggles go to get married?" Harry waved his hand impatiently. No. Covering your face with a white sheet is a muggle sign of death, and a mortuary is where they keep corpses." "Great," Ron muttered, shivering. "I wish your mortuary was the one I'd originally meant. Merlin, begone!" He whispered a quick incantation, an old wizarding rhyme to banish bad luck. Harry raised an eyebrow. "You said Fred and George were teasing you the first time you got petrified. Forgot to counter the spell in time?" Ron groaned. "Exactly. They loitered around, making jokes, and by tea time they untied me, my head was tilted down. I looked up, and zap! I went stiff again." "Right," Harry said thoughtfully. "So changing your line of sight reactivated the petrification?" "Spot on." Suddenly, Ron glanced at the bedside clock. "What time is it now?" Harry checked his watch. 3:15. "We'd better hurry. Defense against the dark arts starts in 5 minutes." Ron lay sprawled on his 4-poster bed in the Hogwarts infirmary, staring up at the ceiling as though it might explain why his afternoon had turned into yet another Dada lesson. "I could have sworn it was evening," he grumbled. "Defense against the dark arts again? I'm supposed to be a patient, for Merlin's sake." He rolled toward Harry, eyes widening with dramatic despair. "Great. Another fumigation session," he moaned. "Harry, do me a favor, will you? See if Madame Pomfrey will let me stay in bed a bit longer." Just then, Madame Pomfrey bustled in, her robes swishing crisply behind her. "No dawdling, children," she announced. "Class starts at 3:30 on the 3rd floor. It's hardly a trek. Off you go." Ron bolted upright, nearly slipping out of bed. Tears glimmered in his eyes, but he blinked them back. "Fine," he muttered, yanking the blankets aside. "But you owe me a proper rest afterward." Madame Pomfrey merely nodded and swept out of the room, leaving Ron and Harry to gather their things. With a final plaintive look at Harry, Ron climbed out of bed, determined that he would collect on that promise, one way or another. Chapter 126. Ryan's Lies. The 3rd-floor corridor was unnervingly quiet. After Madame Pomfrey's 5th and no less urgent warning, Ron reluctantly fell in beside Harry as they made their way to Defense Against the Dark Arts. "It's not fair," Ron muttered, dragging his feet over the cold stone. "I sprained my ankle and I'm stuck in the infirmary for days, but others with a little headache get to roam free?" Harry checked his watch and frowned. "It's 3:35. We're late." "I mean, what's the point?" Ron complained. "Professor Quirrell reeks of garlic. I'd rather sit out here." Harry rolled his eyes, already tired of the subject. Dumbledore promised he'd mention it to Quirrell. Ron sniffed in disdain, but said no more. Footsteps echoed softly as they hurried down the hall toward the classroom door, each step bringing them closer to what awaited inside, late or not. "I'm sure it'll be a lot better this time." No sooner had Harry finished speaking than he regretted it. When he and Ron stepped into the classroom, there was no welcoming fragrance, only the familiar sour tang of Professor Quirrell's unwashed sweat. Oddly enough, it seemed a bit subdued today, with a faint hint of perfume layered on top. Students at Hogwarts had long since grown used to Quirrell's distinctive odor. In fact, there was a Gryffindor third year named Devon who always fought for a front-row seat, desperate to catch every whiff of that pungent scent. Devon had become so fixated, he pestered Professor Quirrell from dawn till dusk. That was before Devon made his regrettable bet. For reasons nobody could quite explain, he challenged his classmates and ended up eating several vixen eggs. The bizarre snack landed him in St. Mungo's and earned him a suspension from school. Rumor had it he lost half a stone while recuperating. But Ron knew what really happened. Over the past week, Quirrell had been preoccupied with helping Dumbledore set up the enchantments around the Philosopher's Stone. Whenever he could steal a moment, the professor slipped off to explore the forbidden fourth floor. No wonder his usual sour aroma was barely noticeable, and poor Devon, caught at the wrong place and wrong time, had paid the price. If I weren't so preoccupied with Dumbledore's safety, I'd have gone to Merlin months ago. In the original timeline, I wouldn't have stormed Hogwarts in a troll's disguise or tried to snatch the Sorcerer's Stone until Halloween. But Harry's last two purifications failed miserably. Instead of restoring Quirrell's strength, they only let Voldemort tighten his grip on Quirrell's mind. Part of the blame lies with Quirrell himself. His arrogance led him to try manipulating Voldemort's power against Harry. Foolishly, he cast that backfiring control spell in his sleep. Now he's trapped, more puppet than master. And yet he never used any of that opportunity to turn to Dumbledore, who might have known how to save him. Well, if Quirrell insists on courting his own doom, let him have at it. I've already given him every chance to come clean. If he dies for refusing help, that's on him. As Harry slipped into the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, Professor Quirrell immediately lurched backward, as though confronted by a rabid dog. Harry didn't hesitate. He darted to the back row and dropped into an empty desk, blissfully unaware that his own potent aroma had driven half the class to the same spot. He was perfectly content to keep his distance from Quirrell. After all, he didn't want to suffer the same disgraceful fate as poor Devon. Ron, however, was not impressed. Having just returned from a checkup with Madame Pomfrey, he strode in expecting at least a nod from the professor. Instead, Quirrell's gaze was fixed entirely on Harry, and Ron's protests were met with polite indifference. By now, nearly every student sat jam-packed into the last two rows, but Hermione Granger stood out. With a theatrical flourish, Professor Quirrell led her to a vacant desk in the front row. Intriguingly, whatever rancid odor hovered around the rest of the room seemed to dissipate completely as Hermione passed by, but Quirrell gave no sign that he'd noticed anything at all. Ever since Ryan completed the ritual, he no longer felt threatened by Voldemort, Dumbledore, or anyone else. Even in Professor Quirrell's Defense Against the Dark Arts class, the very classroom that harbored a fragment of Voldemort's soul, Ryan found himself daring enough to test the professor's warding charms. He was absolutely certain that no one could detect him. At the back of the room, Harry and Ron squeezed alongside Neville. Ron leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Harry, have you noticed Professor Quirrell smells different today?" Harry rolled his eyes. "Ron, you're imagining things. All wizards stink. Who has time to grade their odors?" Neville's round face lit up. "No, really, his scent is fainter. And is that perfume?" Suddenly, Michael's pale face popped into view beside Harry. "Please, Harry, cast that spell again. I'm going to faint if you don't." All the while, Professor Quirrell stood at the podium, stammering through his lecture as if nothing were amiss. He paid no heed to the muffled laughter and whispers rippling through the rows. The first years, nicknamed the Little Hawks, were unusually rowdy, but it wasn't from disrespect. Earlier in the term, Professor Dumbledore had already given them a crash course in Defense Against the Dark Arts. They'd learned to expect harmless skeletons and animated spiders, so Quirrell's jittery performance barely fazed them. With Dumbledore's help, the brightest students have already memorized every key point in this year's Defense Against the Dark Arts syllabus. As a result, most lessons consist of nothing more than thumbing through textbooks, while Professor Quirrell reads straight from a script. Lately, the chatter in the common room has turned toward Roger Davies. Everyone's beginning to wonder if he's lost his mind. After all, Quirrell was once one of his academy's most outstanding graduates. An injury that left him stuttering doesn't mean he's forgotten everything he ever learned. If he'd just abandon the script and teach from his own knowledge, the students insist, he'd be just as good a teacher as before, stutter and all. Harry suddenly felt like a fool. He'd been so quick to dismiss Ron's concerns about bunking the lessons, yet Ron, despite hating to study, wasn't lazy or careless about his magic. He must have weighed all this before suggesting they skip class. Back in the Gryffindor common room, Harry voiced his frustration to Ron. Cramming from these books isn't getting me anywhere. Ron shrugged and dropped onto a worn armchair. Give it a rest, mate. At least we haven't lost any house points over it yet. Harry frowned. Ron might have a point, but if Professor Quirrell didn't start teaching properly soon, Harry had a feeling their luck would run out. I don't want to forfeit house points over this, Harry said, curiosity tugging at him even as he shook his head. Michael's face fell, and Ryan caught Professor Quirrell exhale an almost imperceptible sigh of relief. Hidden beneath her invisibility cloak, Hermione watched the little drama unfold with rapt attention. To everyone else, the classroom was just as stale-smelling as always, but to her it felt startlingly fresh, far removed from the sour, suffocating air she'd experienced last time she'd used that mind-clearing spell. The memory of the dizziness and panic that followed still made her shiver. She edged closer to Ryan. That spell, did you learn it in Atlantis too? He glanced over, his handsome features half in shadow. No, he replied softly. Actually, it's something my family's born with, a faint, inherent magic. If I hadn't gone to Atlantis and learned to control it, I'd probably have drifted through life all alone. Hermione's eyes widened with surprise and sympathy. Oh, Ryan, it's over, Hermione declared, her protective instincts snapping into place as she seized his hand. For a heartbeat, the clamor of the Defense Against the Dark Arts corridor fell away, but when the final bell rang, she reluctantly let go. It wasn't shyness that pulled her back. Any ordinary woman would have thrown caution to the wind under Ryan's striking good looks. Yet at that very moment, the hallway teemed with students spilling out of their last classes, all eager to crowd around Harry and the others inside the classroom. Even Filch turned a blind eye while Mrs. Norris prowled nearby, her eyes narrowing in puzzled interest. If Professor Quirrell hadn't unleashed his little biological weapon, a foul stench that cut through the throng, Harry would never have made it through the crowd to dinner. Hermione released Ryan's hand, though the sour twist of her lips made it painfully clear she had no intention of washing up anytime soon. Chapter 127, Anticipation Before Flight Class. The next morning, the Gryffindor dormitory buzzed with excitement. Ryan, who prided himself on waking before anyone else, was jolted from his usual routine by the clamorous chatter. He sat up, blinked at the unusual light in the common room, and wondered what on earth could have stirred everyone so early. Then it hit him. Harry and Neville. Rumors had circulated the night before that Harry Potter and Neville Longbottom had retreated to the dormitory unusually early. Since word spread, every student arriving for breakfast had peppered Ron Weasley with questions. Normally quick with a joke, Ron now looked painfully uncomfortable. He reddened at every pointed inquiry, blushing as he insisted, half in exasperation, half in shyness, that his name was never Ronnie, but simply Ron, or, when he wanted to sound more formal, Ronald. Occasionally, in moments of self-defense, Ron bristled and declared his loyalty to Harry and Neville, but by the next question, his cheeks would flare again, and he'd fall silent. Conversation inevitably shifted to Draco Malfoy. When someone asked Ron what he thought of the Slytherin, he hedged. He wouldn't hurl insults, nor offer praise, only an enigmatic shrug. That hesitation sparked a new round of whispers. Was it possible Rita Skeeter's portrayal of Ron as generous and big-hearted was accurate after all? As Ryan watched Ron hover between embarrassment and fierce loyalty to his friends, he couldn't help but wonder how this drama would play out when they all mounted their brooms for flight class later that morning. Ron, Michael, Anthony, and Terry had all turned in at their usual hour last night, and Harry and Neville, who went to bed even earlier, were up with the first light. Somehow, whatever had occupied their minds yesterday seemed to have vanished replaced by an energy that woke half the tower before dawn. Ryan, determined to sleep until he woke on his own, subconsciously deployed a soft magical barrier around his ear, blocking out every stray noise he didn't want to hear. In real time, barely a second passed before he was fully awake, and then Ron's triumphant roar shattered the quiet. "First flying lesson at 1 o'clock tomorrow!" Ron bellowed down the hallway. The better-informed first-years had already seen the notices posted in the Gryffindor and Slytherin common rooms announcing a practice session at 3:30 that very afternoon, but they still didn't know when the official course would begin. Now, with the first lesson locked in for 1 p.m. on Friday, excitement rippled through the novice flyers. Even a day's wait couldn't dampen their spirits. After all, tomorrow they'd take to the skies for the very first time. The day began in a whirl of Quidditch fever. Even in the early morning history of magic class, hardly anyone dared close their eyes. Every student whispered excitedly about the upcoming match. By lunchtime, the buzz had only grown. Harry, settled into his usual spot, leaned toward Seamus, who enthusiastically recounted wild tales of his childhood. "I spent most of my early years hurtling through the woods on a broomstick. No nets at all," he announced, eyes bright. Before Harry could respond, Ron cut in from across the table. "That's nothing," he declared. "I nearly ran into a hang glider once, riding Charlie's old half-broken broom, almost ended up tangled in the trees." He waved his hands as if still steering clear of imaginary obstacles. Neville sat quietly beside Harry, but the occasional grin tugging at his lips betrayed how much the day's excitement had lifted the gloom that had weighed on him yesterday. Across the table, Draco Malfoy, who had been brooding just 24 hours ago, was surprisingly chipper. Ryan, watching him closely, realized that Draco's usual scowl was gone. Perhaps it was the promise of the afternoon's flying lesson that had brightened his mood. True to form, Draco took this chance to regale everyone with a series of extravagant, self-aggrandizing stories. Each one placed him at the very center of daring aerial adventures, a dragon chase here, a spectacular broom malfunction narrowly averted there. From Ryan's vantage point, the anecdotes were undoubtedly entertaining, even if the endings tended to fizzle out. Draco paused, sensing his audience's amusement. He beamed. "See?" he crowed, as if craving their admiration. Ryan smiled inwardly. Draco Malfoy might be vain, but he had his merits. His tales were certainly engaging. If only someone else could write the finale. "He always ends by barely dodging a Muggle helicopter," Draco announced triumphantly, wrapping up his latest airborne adventure. Ryan rubbed his chin. If only Malfoy hadn't grown up in a pure-blood family that despised Muggles. If he'd been raised among them, his tales might actually be fresh and exciting. Then again, Ryan thought with a wry smile, if Draco had been a Muggle, Ron's yarns would be even more outlandish. Around them, the older students gave Harry, Ron, Neville, and Draco plenty of room. Yesterday's excitement, watching the four of them take flight, had been electrifying, and neither the professors nor their classmates wanted to spoil the buzz. But without the quartet's panicked faces, as Draco described his narrow escape, the story already felt a little flat to Ryan. Worse yet, he'd started to notice that the signature plot twists from his own Doraemon-inspired fanfic were creeping into half-baked tales told by younger students. Those clever structures were Ryan's inventions. If anyone was going to borrow them, they ought to at least deliver them with the flair Ron brought to his stories. With that thought in mind, Ryan squared his shoulders. He was determined to reclaim his storytelling crown, and this time, he'd make sure no one could copy his moves. Draco and Ron, those two die-hard Doraemon fans, would never admit it, but they'd tried to pinch material straight from their beloved manga. With something as popular as Doraemon, you'd think they'd be afraid of getting caught. Sure enough, it wasn't long before a gaggle of disgruntled young witches and wizards sniffed out their scheme and gleefully spread the news. Harry hardly noticed the commotion at first. Everything had gone so well today that he was practically glowing. That good mood evaporated, however, the moment he glanced over at the Hufflepuff table and spotted Dudley Diggle. It was like a spotlight had been shown on a blind spot he'd completely missed. Both his flying lesson and his Friday morning potions class were grouped with Hufflepuff this term. He hated potions. He hated Snape's contemptuous smirks even more. The worst part was that Snape's praise for Draco Malfoy always came so smoothly, almost flattering, while every comment aimed at Harry felt sharp and dismissive. Harry had even plucked up the courage to ask once why Snape's tone shifted so dramatically when speaking to him, but the professor had only shrugged and offered a curt, "Personal taste, Potter." "Harry?" Ron's voice cut through his thoughts. He looked up to see Ron peering at him with concern. "You look like you've just seen a boggart." Harry forced a smile. "I'm fine. It's just, I realized my classes tomorrow are with Hufflepuff." Ron's eyebrows shot up. "Ouch! Potions first thing Friday morning, right?" "Right." Harry ran a hand through his hair. "And then flying. I'll have to deal with Snape's barbs, and let's not forget the Diggle twins cheering him on." Ron clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, at least it's only one day. We'll get through it." Harry nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of facing Snape and his own unwelcome spotlight, yet again. But if he'd survived worse days at Hogwarts, he could manage one more Friday. At first, Harry wasn't especially thrilled about flying lessons. Other classes struck him as just as magical. That changed, however, when Roger Davis mentioned in passing that Harry's father, James Potter, had been Gryffindor's star seeker. Harry rushed straight to the trophy room to see the broom on display. Flying really was different from everything else. He'd read Quid, Ditch Through the Ages, countless times and dreamed of trying it, but at the Dursleys he'd never even been allowed to buy a basic broomstick by mail. Now, with lessons just around the corner, Harry's excitement gave way to nerves. What if I'm nothing like Dad and end up embarrassing myself, especially in front of Dudley, he fretted to Ron. Ron gave him a reassuring grin. "Don't worry, Harry. That Danley boy's so heavy, I'm not sure any broom could carry him." Nearby, Ryan, who'd been watching the exchange, shook his head in amusement. He'd never get tired of how quickly Harry and Ron turned the prospect of flying lessons into one more reason to tease Dudley. Harry, for his part, felt a small spark of hope flutter back into his chest. "I'd be happy to help polish the chapter, but I'll need you to paste the full text of the machine-translated fanfiction first. Please share the chapter you'd like me to rewrite, and I'll turn it into a smooth-out, idiomatic English version." Chapter 128, The Worn-Out Broom. Friday morning at Hogwarts always carried an extra thrill, flying lesson in the afternoon. As Harry slid into his seat in the Great Hall, Ron was already buzzing with excitement. He leaned forward, voice barely above a whisper. "Harry, did you see Forrest's game last night? Their striker was on fire." Harry barely managed a distracted nod, his mind still lingering on last night's dinner conversation. After Professor McGonagall's flying demonstration, the Gryffindor table had erupted into questions. Seamus Finnegan rattled off every twitch of the broom. Dean Thomas insisted broomsticks were daft, and Neville Longbottom sat wide-eyed, soaking it all in. Neville had never even come close to a broomstick. His grandmother insisted he was too accident-prone to be trusted off the ground. Yet he'd listened with rapt attention as everyone shared tales of swooping, diving, and catching the golden snitch. Even Professor McGonagall's stern warning about safety hadn't dampened their enthusiasm. All except Dean Thomas, that is. He'd produced a battered West Ham poster, complete with curling edges, and proclaimed, "Football's where the real action is. Brooms are slow and boring." Most students had barely paid him any mind, the poster's faded players more fascinating for their static stares than Dean's argument. But Ron took the bait. He and Dean spent the rest of dinner debating which sport reigned supreme, voices rising and falling like the cheers at a Quidditch match. Harry finished his breakfast and traded a grin with Hermione across the table. Today, the skies over the Quidditch pitch awaited them. And whether the broom was brand new or long worn, Harry had never looked forward to flying more. After listening patiently to Dean Thomas's brief rundown of Muggle football, there's only one ball on the field, and nobody's allowed to fly. He couldn't help blurting out, "What's so exciting about a game like that?" That evening, once dinner was over and his homework finally checked off, he made a beeline for the only other Muggle born in the dormitory, Harry Potter. By the time the second dinner rolled around, he was still peppering Harry with questions about football. Harry, for his part, dredged up every scrap of memory he had of matches he'd glimpsed on television at his aunt's house. Although the Dursleys owned a TV and kept it running all day, Dudley jealously guarded the remote. The moment Harry edged too close, Dudley would wail and stamp his foot as if Harry had committed some grave crime simply by watching. As a result, Harry's real exposure to football had been limited to the occasional primary school match and a handful of brief TV flashes. He'd already told his inquisitor everything he could remember, yet the questions kept coming. Since their arrival at Hogwarts, and the surprising twist of finding himself in Ravenclaw, his friend's curiosity about Muggle sports had taken on a strangely single-minded intensity. No amount of polite explanation seemed to satisfy him. He just kept leaning in, determined to unlock the secret of football's enduring thrill. Harry finally seemed to grasp why football could be so thrilling. Lisa Dupin shot him a panicked look. "Harry, just answer him. Quickly. Or make something up," she hissed, anxiety still clinging to her voice. Earlier, Ron had teased her mercilessly over her boast that there's no Dumbledore in our family, deriding it as another symptom of the so-called curse of understanding. "What should I say?" Harry whispered, but before he could think of a reply, Ron reappeared, a plate piled high with potatoes and meat pie in his hands. "Why did they park the pies all the way over there?" Ron grumbled, glaring at the far end of the table. Fortunately for Harry and Lisa, the dinner hour was nearly over, and the prospect of Professor Snape's potions class was all it took to distract Ron from football. Muttering about dungeons and dark magic, he scooped up his fork and hurried off. Harry followed, entering the cold, stone-walled potions classroom well before the torches had had a chance to sputter out. Dudley, as usual, took a seat as far from Harry as possible. Here at Hogwarts, these two were practically strangers, and they barely exchanged a glance. Moments later, Snape swept in, his long black cloak trailing behind him like a shadow. His dark eyes swept the room with disdain, save for a brief, inscrutable flicker whenever they landed on Harry. To everyone else, he appeared utterly certain the world owed him a standing ovation for his mastery of potions, and that each of them was failing to provide it. Professor Snape unfolded the parchment he'd been examining, his dark eyes gliding down the list until they paused at Harry's name. Lifting his gaze, he aligned the names on his list with the students standing before him. "I have a question for you, Mr. Potter," he announced, voice cool. "Why did I assign you a pewter crucible instead of brass or copper?" Harry met Snape's stare without flinching. Among the three common crucible materials, brewing efficiency ranks from highest to lowest as copper, brass, then tin. Pewter falls below brass and copper, so it slows down the heating process. Snape inclined his head slightly. "Precisely. And why, Mr. Potter, is copper preferable?" "Because," Harry continued, "copper conducts heat most evenly and quickly, which is invaluable for complex or time-sensitive potions. It gives an experienced brewer far greater control over the reaction." A faint, approving curl touched Snape's lips. He turned to Ron Weasley, whose own crucible still gleamed unused. "Very good, Weasley. Perhaps you might learn something from Mr. Potter's preparation. Sitting next to talent does not guarantee you absorb it by osmosis." "I almost forgot. Ravenclaw gets 2 points. The words barely left the professor's lips before Ron's face turned as purple as an overripe plum. After class, he stomped through the corridor, scowling at Harry. "Why does Snape always single me out? Harry, could you ask him to lay off?" Harry shrugged. "Honestly, mate, I think Snape just sees you as a joke in his potions class. He thinks you're not taking it seriously." Neville leaned in, voice low. "Or maybe Snape read that article by Rita Skeeter and actually believes her nonsense about you." "Damn Rita Skeeter," Ron muttered under his breath, jabbing a finger into his other palm in frustration. At 1 o'clock, Ryan and the rest of the Ravenclaw first years hurried down the castle steps and spilled onto the Quidditch pitch for their very first flying lesson. The sky was a brilliant blue, and a gentle breeze made the grass ripple like tiny waves as they crossed the sloping hill toward the flat expanse in the center of the field. Beyond the pitch, the Forbidden Forest's dark silhouette swayed softly in the wind. They were the only students there. The Hufflepuffs hadn't arrived yet. 20 broomsticks lay neatly in a row on the grass, ancient, worn models that looked as though they'd seen better days. The rookies exchanged nervous glances. Today's lesson was going to be one for the books. The Daily Prophet's story was right. Fudge really is cutting Hogwarts' budget. In his official reply, the Minister of Magic insisted he's merely trimming unnecessary expenses to redirect funds where they're needed most. To Fudge, that apparently includes the flying brooms used in lessons. After all, he argued, the old models still work. If you can call a broom that rattles at high altitude, hungrily veers to the left, and drops you unceremoniously instead of gliding down a proper landing run, working. Just then, the Hufflepuff squad trundled onto the field, and at their head was Dudley Dursley. Ryan couldn't help noticing how easily Dudley had reclaimed his spot as class leader, hardly surprising, since he was fresh off defending his title as Southeast Youth Interschool Heavyweight Boxing Champion. Watching him stride forward so confidently, Ryan felt a flicker of surprise. Dudley's magical aptitude, long stunted by his Muggle upbringing, now seemed to be bouncing back with eel vigor. Could it be Lily's spell at work, breathing life into magic that had nearly withered away? Dudley had always shown the uncanny aptitude of a seasoned wizard, and with his solid, muscular frame, he looked every bit the part. Were it not for Ryan's steady hand guiding him through Hogwarts, this story might as well have been titled Dudley Dursley's Daily Life at Hogwarts. Lost in that thought, Ryan barely registered the arrival of the flying instructor. Madame Hooch swept into the clearing, her cropped gray hair bristling in the breeze, and her steely yellow eyes, sharp as an eagle's, scanning the students. "What are you waiting for?" she called, her voice crisp and commanding. "Everyone, take your brooms and stand by them. Now! Move it, move it!" With no time for formal introductions, she stepped back, raised her whistle, and in an instant the flying lesson was underway. Chapter 129, The Magical 1,000-Pound Pendant. It was 1 o'clock sharp when the students gathered on the flat stretch of grass just beyond Hogwarts grounds, each standing beside a polished flying broom. The Hufflepuffs trembled with nerves, but the Ravenclaws brimmed with confidence. After all, they'd already pored over the origin of Quidditch and even attended a special lecture by a current team chaser. Flying, they decided, would be a breeze. Madame Hooch swept into view, her sharp eyes scanning the group. Without taking attendance, she wasted no time on pleasantries. "Extend your right hand over the handle," she called out, "and say clearly, 'Up! Up!'" The students chorused. For a handful of them, the brooms leapt obediently into their hands. Harry's own Nimbus 2000, like Ryan's, sprang up at once. Other brooms, however, remained stubbornly still, wobbling at their owner's feet. Among the eager novices was Ernie Macmillan of Hufflepuff, broad-shouldered, self-confident, and famously industrious. Just the day before, he'd cornered Harry and Ron in the dungeon corridor before potions. "How many hours a day do you manage to revise?" he'd asked, brow furrowed in genuine concern. His relentless dedication had become something of a legend by now. But Madame Hooch had no time for chatter. She raised her hand, and in the ensuing silence, the flutter of nervous excitement rippled through the students, each one steeling themselves for their first taste of flight. The classroom was buzzing with idle chatter while the students waited for their lesson to begin. Ron leaned forward on the edge of his desk, tapping his finger thoughtfully against the polished wood. "I don't know," he said to Ernie Macmillan. "Maybe a few hours." Ernie raised an eyebrow. "More or fewer than 8? Ron shrugged and shot Ernie a slightly nervous look. "Fewer, I'd guess." Ernie puffed out his chest. "I average 8 hours of study every day, sometimes 9. I squeeze in an hour before breakfast, so I usually hit that mark without issue. On weekends, if I'm on form, I stretch it to 10. Monday, I manage 9.5, but Tuesday, only 7.25. And then Wednesday." A sharp knock at the door cut him off. Professor Snape swept in, his dark robes swirling, and the entire room fell silent. At the front, a neat row of flying brooms waited for their next owners. Harry's stomach fluttered. He'd heard Hagrid say that magical implements, brooms included, seem to mirror your confidence, much like a horse responds to a rider's calm or nervous energy. For a moment, Harry's chest tightened with doubt. But then his mind drifted to a childhood memory of before Voldemort's attack, when he'd flown a toy broom as easily as breathing. Although all recollection of that time was gone, the instinct remained. He knew he could summon it. Ernie Macmillan, Ever proud, especially in the world he'd left behind, stepped forward first. With a practiced flick of his wand, the nearest broom rose smoothly into his hand. Watching that graceful success, Ryan, who'd witnessed Ernie's boastful claims firsthand, was not the least bit surprised. Anthony, who'd narrowly missed becoming a Ravenclaw prefect, must have lost his nerve when Harry mounted his broom. His broomstick lifted only a few inches before stalling, wobbling, then dropping back to the ground. He'd come so close. Ron and Neville fared similarly. They had the same model broom as Anthony, and theirs, too, hovered briefly before failing to gain altitude. Hermione's broom didn't even lift. It simply slid across the grass, just like most true beginners' attempts, though she looked thoroughly exasperated. This was her first flying lesson, after all, and she'd expected better than a broom that refused to launch. Only Dudley Dursley and one Wayne Hopkins couldn't get off the ground at all. Wayne was a name I didn't recognize. He never came up in Harry's books until I stumbled on them in one of my 2 most treasured possessions. I keep 2 small notebooks filled with my earliest doodles and notes on Harry Potter. Most of what I sketched never made it into the final novels, though a handful of those odd lines of dialogue did appear, word for word, in later editions. In one of these notebooks, I cataloged the names of 40 students in Harry's year: Harry, Ron, Hermione, and 37 others, alongside their houses. Tiny symbols next to each name indicated each child's place of origin. Wayne Hopkins was among the original 40 I'd noted down in Rowling's earliest drafts. In her final version, he's still officially a Hogwarts student, but the story never shows him through Harry's eyes. Until now. Ryan watched the new flyer with keen interest. After a few moments, he realized the boy wasn't much different from the other first-year witches and wizards standing nervously around him. Madame Hooch, fresh to her role as flying instructor, wove through the throng, demonstrating how to mount a broom without flipping off the bristles and adjusting each student's grip. Unsurprisingly, the ones who struggled the most came from long-established wizarding families. Years of tinkering with toy brooms had left them with all manner of awkward, instinctive holds. Ron Weasley, by contrast, whose brother Charlie had just become the top seeker on the national Quidditch team, seemed born to ride a broom. Madame Hooch almost didn't need to glance at his hands. They were already perfect. Harry, though, outdid them all. He gripped the handle exactly as she would teach, his stance absolutely textbook. Even Dudley, who'd never shown any interest in magic until now, mastered the hold almost instantly. Perhaps he'd perfected the necessary reflex from all those times he'd thwacked Harry with his belaying whip at home. After about half an hour of practice, Madame Hooch decreed them ready. "All right, everyone," she called, raising her whistle to her lips. "On my signal, push down with your legs and lift off. Keep the broom steady, rise about 4 feet, then lean forward just enough to guide yourself straight back down. Ready? 1, 2, 3. She blew the whistle sharply, and a dozen broomsticks shot into the air in a flurry of robes and wide eyes. "Listen to my whistle. 3, 2. Almost every first year was already bobbing in midair atop their broomsticks. Everyone, that is, except Dudley Dursley. True to his Uncle Harry's skepticism about magic, Dudley refused to trust the broom. Despite possessing the raw power of an adult wizard, he planted both feet firmly on the ground, his disbelief and fear outweighing any instinct to fly. From Ryan's point of view, the broom eagerly siphoned Dudley's magical energy and began to lift. But Dudley's profound lack of confidence generated an invisible anchoring force between himself and the earth, completely countering the broom's upward pull. In fact, the ground gravity only intensified, until snap, the broom shattered in 2, and Dudley tumbled back to the turf. Madame Hooch and the other students stared in astonishment, while Harry couldn't help but curl his lip in rueful satisfaction. Ryan was equally amazed. Well done, Dudley, who knew he'd mastered a magical version of the 1,000-pound pendant. If he stayed this grounded, he'd never learn to fly after all. Madame Hooch knelt beside the crushed broom and steadied Dudley. "Impossible," she whispered, incredulous. "In over 20 years of teaching, no first-year witch or wizard has ever managed to snap a practice broom." "What's your name?" Miss Huo asked, eyes widening in surprise. "Dudley Dursley," the boy replied, his voice quivering. He hunched his shoulders, as if trying to make himself smaller, though it did him no good under her steady gaze. Silently, Miss Huo repeated his name to herself, committing it to memory. "All right," she said at last. "Hold on a moment. A broomstick is a delicate instrument. Trying to force it back to its original shape could cause serious damage. I'm going down to the broom cupboard in the first-floor foyer to fetch a spare so we can compare." She spun toward the rest of the class. "Everyone else, rack your broom's knee, TLI, and stay away from them until I return. If I catch anyone fooling around, you'll see your house points disappear fast." With that warning, Miss Huo strode from the room, and the door clicked softly behind her. Silence stretched out like a heavy curtain. Finally, Michael leaned toward Anthony and whispered, "Did you see that? It wasn't magic." Chapter 130, Failed Attempt. Around 2 o'clock, the Quidditch pitch buzzed with excitement. Students lined the edges of the field, brooms untouched at Madame Hooch's strict command. In one corner, the Ravenclaws huddled over their textbooks, debating whether anyone had ever recorded an incident like Dudley's. Nearby, a group of curious Hufflepuffs peppered him with questions. What did it feel like? How did he manage it? Scribbling down every detail. The scene was surprisingly tame. From a distance, Ryan scowled. Being a Ravenclaw had never felt lonelier. If only a few Gryffindors or Slytherins were here, a proper quarrel would have broken out by now. Instead, Dudley, the school bully, was fitting in seamlessly with the patient Hufflepuffs, answering their inquiries with embarrassing candor and unfailing politeness. Ryan couldn't decide whether to be annoyed or impressed. He stared at Dudley, puzzling over this sudden change. Were Hufflepuffs simply that kind-hearted, or did Dudley reserve all his nastiness for Harry? No, Ryan reminded himself of the old timeline, where Dudley tormented everyone indiscriminately. He and his gang vandalized playground equipment, smoked on street corners, even flung stones at passing cars and children. While everyone else chatted excitedly about the magical anomaly, Ryan remained lost in thought, struggling to reconcile the notorious bully he knew with the one who now stood patiently fielding questions. Could Lily's old love spell have affected Dudley the way it did Harry, damping his worst impulses and filling him with more positive energy, now that he's shown signs of magic? Aunt Amelia Bones told me Dudley only awakened his powers at 11, on the third night of term, Susan Bones volunteered, tucking a loose braid behind her ear. Anthony's eyes widened. Wait, your Aunt's Amelia Bones? The head of magical law enforcement at the Ministry? That's incredible. He flushed, perhaps remembering how he'd bragged about his own tenuous connection to Newt Scamander's wife, while Susan had never flaunted her family ties. Before Susan could respond, Terry stepped in, voice low. "Did Aunt Amelia ever say what happened to Barty Crouch Jr.? I heard neither he nor his father went to Azkaban. They're under house arrest, barred from leaving their estate." The group fell silent, reality of the punishment settling in. Within moments, every question circled back to Amelia Bones, her influence, her work, and what it meant for Dudley's future. Ryan, watching from the edge of the circle, simply nodded. He, too, understood why Susan's aunt had become the evening's hot topic. Amelia Burns was one of the rarest and most powerful witches of her generation. In the original timeline, Lord Voldemort himself had broken into her home and slain her. No small testament to his utter disregard for dueling decorum. Although he was well over a decade her senior, Voldemort preyed on her talents as though bullying a mere child. But that dreadful ending was only the beginning. In countless alternate futures, Voldemort went on to eliminate every witch or wizard who even hinted at Albus Dumbledore's potential. It's no wonder Cornelius Fudge finally felt compelled to intervene. Like a solitary sheep leading a pride of lions, he convinced the Ministry to adopt his timid, pacifist stance, hoping in effect to turn every wizard into a vegetarian. "Ryan," Penelope interrupted, breaking his concentration during their wizard's chess match, "are you saying that the Prewett brothers, Molly Weasley's siblings who were killed by Voldemort, also had Dumbledore's kind of talent?" Ryan paused, eyes on the board. "Exactly that," he replied quietly. "They devoted themselves entirely to the study of magic, ignoring all other distractions. Had they lived to an age comparable to Dumbledore's, their mastery would have been virtually indistinguishable from his." With that, he fell silent again, his mind racing through the endless possibilities their conversation had unleashed. Amelia had decided to set aside her law enforcement duties at the ministry and devote herself entirely to studying and honing her magical skills. Even if Voldemort were to return, she'd have a fighting chance, provided she could focus on nothing but her training. Of course, most witches and wizards couldn't simply walk away from their day jobs, Ryan reflected. It was a luxury few could afford. Silence settled over the practice field until Madame Hooch appeared, striding forward with a well-worn broom tucked under her arm. "Not bad," she said, setting it down carefully. "This one didn't budge an inch." She turned to Dudley. "All right, Mr. Dursley, your turn. Give it another try." Dudley nodded eagerly and gripped the broom. Snap! The handle splintered beneath his strength, and he went tumbling to the ground with a heavy thud. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. Ryan, however, was more intrigued than astonished. Dudley's fall wasn't just clumsy. There was a raw power in the way he hit the grass, the way he braced himself. If he ever learned to direct that force in a spell, or even a broom maneuver, no wizard would stand a chance. A single impact from him could be devastating. Madame Hooch sighed and offered Dudley a hand up. "Mr. Dursley," she said with a wry smile, "I'm afraid you'll be grounded, quite literally, for the rest of today's lesson." Madame Hooch sighed, a hint of regret in her voice. "I can't hold up the rest of the class, Dudley. If we stop now, we'll have to reschedule." "Reschedule what?" Dudley asked, rubbing the back of his head. He noticed the faint flush on Madame Hooch's cheeks, but pressed on, oblivious. "If you keep this up," Ron broke in with a smirk, "we'll have an excuse to order new brooms." A ripple of laughter passed through the Hufflepuff row. They knew exactly what she meant. "Here," a cheerful voice called out. "You can use my broom, Dudley." "Never abandon, never give up," another student cheered. "Unity and mutual assistance. That's the true spirit of Hufflepuff. Dudley, take mine." Madame Hooch glanced at the outstretched hands and smiled briefly, clearly moved by their generosity. But the moment passed, and she quickly reminded them of her role as instructor. "All right, everyone, let's settle down and continue." She stepped back to the center of the field. "Remember, grip the broom handle firmly, push off with your legs, and rise just a few feet before you lean gently to the left." The students followed her guidance. Steady grips, wary glances at the sky. "Excellent. Now lean to the right. That's it. Back to center, and lean backwards slightly." One by one, they rose into the air with varying degrees of success. Madame Hooch's watchful eye caught every wobble, every overcorrection. Except for young Ryan, who seemed determined to stay rooted to the ground, Harry Potter proved a natural. His movements were smooth, confident. He lifted off without a tremor, shifted from side to side at her instruction, and even managed a graceful backward lean that drew a rare approving nod from Madame Hooch. As the lesson continued, it became clear to everyone on the pitch, Harry was born to fly. Madame Hooch motioned for the rest of the students to lean forward and lie flat so that Harry would have an unobstructed flight path, and so that everyone could witness a display of broom work beyond what even the most seasoned players often manage. With a swift kick of his feet, Harry propelled himself upward. His robes billowed behind him, the wind whistling through his hair as he climbed higher against the bright sky. From below came a chorus of gasps and excited screams. Even the older girls pressed forward to catch a better view. Ron, eyes wide, shouted up in admiration, "Brilliant, Harry!" After a few triumphant moments, Madame Hooch's sharp voice rang out. "All right, Harry, you can come down now. In all my years at Hogwarts, I've never seen a first-year ascend like that. You should definitely try out for the school team. Wait for me after class, please. I want to recommend you to Professor Flitwick." "Madame Hooch," Ron blurted out, "he did exactly what you told him to do. He's so," needed oddly earnest, as if he'd missed the genuine praise ringing in her tone. She shook her head, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "No, that's not it at all. I simply wish to exercise a right I'm entitled to, and you did splendidly, Harry." With that, she signaled him to land, her eyes still bright with approval. Chapter 131, Seeker. At 3:00, right after flying class, Madame Hooch mysteriously spirited Harry away. He didn't return to the common room until well into dinner time. By the time he slipped into the Great Hall, other houses were deep in hushed chatter about Dudley's spectacular broom crash, but every Ravenclaw head turned the moment he walked in. "Are you kidding me?" Ron's fork hovered in midair. If it's true, Hermione said with her usual precision, you'd be the youngest player on Ravenclaw's Quidditch team in a century. Harry sank into his seat. Professor Flitwick recommended me as a substitute. He wants me in the team's regular training sessions. Hermione nodded. Our captain, Johnny, the Seeker, is in his 7th year and barely shows up for practice. We can design tactics all day, but without a Seeker, there's no real training. Ron stared. So, you're actually going to train as Seeker? Roger, the team's manager, approached Professor Flitwick, Harry explained. He said I'm light on my feet and quick, perfect Seeker material. Flitwick agreed, and here I am. A ripple of excitement ran through the Ravenclaws at the table. Harry felt a surge of anticipation. Chasing the golden snitch was the sport's ultimate rush, and now he had the chance to do it for real. Hermione reached across the table, beaming. Congratulations, Harry. Ron slapped him on the back. Welcome to Ravenclaw Quidditch. Harry smiled, already picturing himself diving after the snitch. All right, then. Seeker Potter reporting for duty. He even asked me to dive 30 feet right on the spot and catch the golf ball he threw, Harry said with a casual shrug as he settled onto the edge of an armchair. Anthony blinked, mouth agape. 30 feet? Dive 30 feet? Harry, that's not something a normal wizard or anyone else can pull off. Before Harry could reply, Michael leaned forward. Then, what about the broom? Hermione held up a hand to quiet him. First years aren't allowed to fly their own brooms yet. Harry managed a wry smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Professor Flitwick insisted I order one through Owlpost, so I went ahead and bought a Nimbus 2000. He glanced down at his hands, as if still counting the gold galleons he'd spent. Roger Davis kept pushing me to get the cross-sweep 7 stars. He called the Nimbus overrated rubbish. Hermione exchanged a quick look with Anthony before replying. Thankfully, Captain Johnson stepped in with the performance data. Right now, the Nimbus 2000 is officially the fastest broom available. As a Seeker, I need a broom that's both fast and steady. A model like the cross-sweep, renowned for its stability, is ideal for chasers, beaters, and keepers, but not quite enough for someone in my position. That's why, when Captain Johnny offered to lend me his cross-sweep 6-star this semester, I politely declined. I appreciate it, I told him, but I've saved up for a Nimbus 2000. Ron's eyes nearly popped out of his head. A Nimbus 2000? Harry, that thing costs a fortune. When you get it, you've got to let me take it for a spin. Hermione shot him a warning look. Ron, you know first years aren't supposed to bring their own brooms to Hogwarts. Exactly. Ron interrupted, grinning. So I'll just sneak it into my flying lessons. Brilliant Ravenclaw strategy, right? Before Hermione or I could respond, 2 older students sauntered into the Great Hall. They were the same pair who'd spent the last week insisting Roger Diggle was hopeless and that the Nimbus was the pinnacle of broomcraft. Spotting me, they made a beeline across the room. One of them, a tall boy with a pronounced cleft in his chin, stopped in front of our table and curled his lip. Well, well, he drawled. Look who it is. Don't go thinking we're your friends now, just because you've been bad-mouthing Diggle with us. I frowned, genuinely puzzled by his sudden hostility. What are you talking about? I began, but they merely glanced at each other, smirked, and turned away, leaving me more bewildered than befull. Ray. Harry watched the 2 blonde chasers exchange greetings, a frown forming on his face. He couldn't shake the question. Why had Roger insisted on hosting this Quidditch symposium? It felt oddly like a veiled criticism of him. Second year, the taller of the 2 said, stepping forward. I haven't even introduced myself yet. You must be Harry Potter. First year or not, you're Harry Potter. I hope you live up to that name. The other chaser, lean with a sharp chin, gave Harry a confident nod. I'm Henry Phoenix, he said, and this is Walter. Roger told us about you both. We're the other 2 chasers on the team. Henry tapped his chin. Listen, we've never won the Quidditch Cup, he declared, but this year is different, because I'm on the team. Walter let out a low laugh. Come on, second year. How can you possibly compete with Harry Potter? Without another word, the 2 strode away, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Harry turned to Ron, unease flickering in his green eyes. I don't know, Ron. Our team seems so fractured. They were bad-mouthing Roger just before this. Ron shrugged, concern creasing his forehead. That's what worries me. If they can't even get along, how do they expect to win the cup? Harry offered a small, grateful smile. At least Henry seems to think I'm worth an exception, despite being a first year. Yes, Ron said, glancing after the departing chasers. You are Harry Potter. If anyone dares to cause you trouble, Harry, I'll be the first to object. Anthony Hunt burst in, his tone fierce enough to turn heads. He'd seen Harry's potential firsthand and would defend him faster than Ron ever could. Terry, the dark-skinned boy whose easy smile belied a sharp wit, leaned in. Harry, should we keep this under wraps? Harry gave a wry shrug. I doubt it. Everyone at Hogwarts already knows. Across the table, Lavender Brown nodded eagerly, her hair catching the flicker of torchlight. Sensing the hall's buzz growing louder by the second, Harry politely excused himself and slipped away to Gryffindor Tower, hoping to contain the rumors before they spread beyond the common room. It was a wise move. Harry Potter, already the talk of the school after 2 front-page articles in the Daily Prophet and 2 victorious duels against professors, had just become the youngest competitor in a century to enter the International Wizarding Duel Championship. Barely a minute after he left, his empty seat to Ryan's right was swarmed by curious onlookers. Among them stood Mr. Wood of the Ministry's Intelligence Division, posing as a visiting professor, but watching every movement with calculated interest. Then the air in the great hall seemed to shift. A faint glimmer of light appeared behind Ryan, and a hushed gasp rippled through those sensitive enough to notice. The moon phantom had arrived. Cloaked in a robe of shifting starlight, and with its face hidden beneath a sparkling hood, it was a spirit so powerful that only wizards of at least level 7 could perceive it. For an instant, time stood still. Every student and faculty member in the hall, save those still oblivious to the phantom's presence, held their breath, caught between awe and apprehension at this mysterious apparition. Its arrival was an ominous herald, marking Harry Potter's growing legend in ways none of them could yet fathom. Ryan closed his eyes and whispered the chant in his mind. The latent power of the spirit surged through him, and in an instant, the young wizards gathered around him blinked, as if a veil of confusion had been lifted from their minds. They looked at him with clear, focused eyes, each recalling the mission they'd momentarily forgotten. In that moment, Ryan realized just how bizarre the situation was. It felt exactly like being a stand user from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. If his ability were ranked, it would land at A Tier 5, on par with Dio's heavenly creation, the power to rewrite reality itself. The key difference was that Ryan's gift drew on magical energy, and he wasn't confined to gesturing with his hands. He could reshape the world simply by manifesting his spiritual avatar. He shook his head, half amused. Honestly, channeling your own spirit to rewrite reality is just a more elaborate spell, he thought. After all, every wizard's incantation is essentially a tiny act of divine creation, each one a miniature rewrite of how things ought to be. By that measure, his stand-like power barely exceeded a level 7 spell. It granted him a fragment of godly might, long before anyone would call him a true deity, as if he'd stumbled into some kingdom of God, far beyond ordinary magic. His mind wandered for a moment to Harry Potter's final book, the scene where Harry enters a spectral afterlife that resembles a god of death's realm. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd just crossed into something similar in his own world. Right, a voice called, jolting him back. Don't forget, we set sail for Atlantis, the sunken city, first thing tomorrow. Harry, still brimming with self-satisfaction at the thought of becoming the new Seeker, slowly opened his eyes. Across the room, Ryan rubbed his chin in contemplation. In the next instant, he divided himself into 2 identical figures, and then, as if propelled by some unseen force, both versions of him flickered out of existence. Chapter 132. Ron, a Man of Compassion. Saturday morning arrived, and Harry lay in bed for the first time in what felt like ages. Ron had already tugged at the blankets and called his name half a dozen times, but Harry just rolled over and burrowed deeper under the quilt. This week had pushed him to his limits, both physically and mentally, and all he wanted now was a few precious hours of rest. Back in the Great Hall on Thursday, Harry had sensed something shifting in the way his classmates looked at him. They still whispered about the scar on his forehead, but their eyes no longer held pity. Instead, there was a spark of curiosity and, surprisingly, respect. Harry had braced himself for rumors to spread that he was just another bumbling, average wizard. Instead, his reputation seemed to be taking on a life of its own. Even Peeves, the poltergeist whom students usually gave a wide berth, had gone out of his way to avoid Harry. No shrieks of carpet day or airborne chandeliers, just an eerie silence whenever the ghost passed through the corridors near him. If that wasn't a sign that something unusual was happening, Harry didn't know what was. The most unsettling discovery, however, had come from Professor Quirrell. During their last Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson, Harry had stood before Quirrell ready to duel. In that moment, he had felt, quite impossibly, a rush of warmth and an otherworldly energy radiating from the professor's body. It wasn't magic as Harry knew it. His own magic was like a third hand, somewhat clumsy, needing a wand and a spoken spell to perform its work. This new force, though, seemed to grow from the very marrow of Quirrell's bones. When Harry touched it, he'd felt a sense of wholeness, as if the world finally slid neatly into place around him. So now, curled under the covers, Harry let the memories wash over him. Each strange encounter this week had been a reminder that life at Hogwarts, and perhaps magic itself, was far more mysterious than he had ever imagined. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Harry, you awake?" came Ron's familiar voice. Harry pressed his face into the pillow. After everything that had happened, Quirrell's hidden power, Peeves's silent treatment, it felt impossible to say more than a tired, "Go away." But he knew Ron was worried, and deep down, he was grateful that his best friend still cared enough to check on him. With a sigh, Harry summoned his courage and called back, "Come in." The door swung open, and Ron stood there, hair mussed and robes rumpled. In his hand was a steaming mug of cocoa. "Do you want this?" he asked, stepping into the room and carefully perching on the edge of Harry's bed. Harry blinked up at him. "Thanks," he croaked, reaching for the cup. The hot chocolate was sweet and soothing in his palms. Ron studied him for a moment, concern flickering in his green eyes. "You've been out of it all week. What's going on with you?" Harry hesitated. How could he explain the impossible? The way he suddenly drew power from Quirrell's hidden light, the way Peeves wouldn't even dare play his tricks. Part of him ached to share everything, but another part feared how unbelievable it sounded. Instead, he set the mug down and forced a small smile. "Just tired," he said. "I'll be fine. I promise." Ron reached out and ruffled Harry's hair, just like he used to before Hogwarts turned their lives upside down. "Right," he said, voice gentle. "Well, if you need anything, you let me know, okay?" "Okay," Harry agreed, and for the first time that morning, he believed it. As Ron left the room, Harry closed his eyes again, clutching the warmth of that mug and the rare, steadfast kindness of a true friend. Perhaps life at Hogwarts would never be ordinary again, but in that moment, Harry Potter felt ready to face whatever came next, bolstered by a simple human bond that no magic, no matter how strange, could ever replace. Harry felt his exhaustion and disgust pour into the foul haze clinging to Quirrell's corpse, and then, just like that, it was gone. He let himself tie Hink Riley. If ever anyone deserved the title The Boy Who Lived, it was him. Even more astonishing was the next revelation. Dudley was a wizard too. Harry couldn't help but notice the delicious irony in how Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon would react to this second freak, their own precious son. In their eyes, Dudley could do no wrong. Their blind adoration was every bit as absurd as their cold disregard for Harry. Consider Dudley's dreadful school reports. Every time a teacher complained about his grades, Aunt Petunia would erupt in tears, insisting that Dudley was a misunderstood genius and that the poor educators simply didn't appreciate his innate talents. Uncle Vernon, ever terrified of his heir becoming a sissy nerd, would shoot Harry a look full of veiled contempt and announce, "I refuse to let my boy waste his life with books." They even dismissed all accusations of bullying. "He's just full of energy," they'd coo. "He wouldn't hurt a fly." Aunt Petunia would clutch her handkerchief, as though any criticism of Dudley threatened to break her heart. Harry could already hear their next excuses. Petunia would be weeping that Dudley's magical gift proved his brilliance, if only Harry hadn't led him astray. Vernon would gleefully crow that Dudley was a model wizard, unlike Harry, who'd apparently been waving around a girly little wand. The hypocrisy made Harry's jaw clench. And as absurd as their double standards were, Harry knew the Dursleys would maintain them without a second thought. Harry shifted in bed, turning onto his side until he found a comfortable position. His thoughts drifted back to Dudley's unexpected arrival, and the way it had laid bare the truth of his past for every witch and wizard at Hogwarts. The looks in their eyes had shifted too. Admiration turned suddenly to pity. Whether in the Great Hall or strolling between classes, Harry and Ron had found their pockets stuffed with sweets, lobbed at them by sympathetic classmates. Ron, of course, was delighted. He munched on chocolate frogs and Bertie Bott's every flavor beans as if there were no tomorrow. Harry, on the other hand, felt a pang every time he remembered the reason for all this fuss: Dudley's betrayal. He assumed Ron would be equally upset, but to his surprise, that wasn't the case. When Harry finally asked what bothered him, Ron's complaint was almost absurdly petty. "Look at this," Ron grumbled, waving a parchment. "My parents didn't even spell my name right. Who does that?" He squinted at the letter, its handwriting loopy and unfamiliar. "I mean, Harry, seriously? Do you think I could write a book about this? Get some older wizard to pen it for me? You know, like that talkative professor who's always going on about publishing one day." Harry couldn't help but smile at Ron's short-sighted frustration. Most of the time, Ron had an uncanny knack for reading people and situations. But the moment something struck too close to home, especially if it had anything to do with himself, his judgment went out the window. And so here he was, worrying about a misspelled name when Harry's entire life story lay exposed for all of Britain to see. Harry sat up in bed, arms crossed, as Ron peppered Lisa Dupin with questions about the curse, completely oblivious to the stormy glares of Hermione and Lisa, who looked on the verge of tears. No sooner had he extracted every grisly detail than he turned those same questions on me, firing off one football-related query after another. It was as if my own painful history had vanished from his mind, all in the name of settling that argument we'd had with Dean Thomas. Dean and I couldn't be more different. His adoptive Muggle father is so wealthy that he's fostered enough children to field an entire football team. So of course Dean grew up kicking a ball in every spare moment. Me? I'd already explained to Ron a dozen times that I spent my summers at my relative's house doing nothing but chores. There simply wasn't time to learn the rules of football, let alone play it. Now Ron was back at my bedside, nudging me and insisting we go for a walk in the grounds. I pretended to be asleep, hoping he'd give up. Between the cursed chatter, the endless football questions, and the constant swirl of excitement that seemed to follow me these days, I needed every ounce of rest I could get. After all, just yesterday, before flying class, when I was more nervous than ever, I'd managed to climb onto a broom and stay there without tumbling off. Small victories, perhaps, but victories all the same. Harry barely needed to grip the meteor's handle before a familiar warmth washed over him, as if he'd just reunited with an old friend. Despite the nervous buzz in his veins, he surrendered to that instinctive comfort and swung himself onto the broom. The spot where his trousers met the shaft felt inexplicably plush, like settling onto a soft cushion. Harry couldn't help but marvel. Elio Smith, whose name was practically legendary for inventing cushioned seats, had really outdone himself this time. Magic, he reminded himself, was endlessly surprising. He recognized the broom instantly. It was a meteor model, kindly resurrected from Cosmic Broom Company's 1955 lineup. Even after more than 4 decades, its handling was as smooth and intuitive as on day one. Granted, its top speed and lift had waned slightly over the years, but for teaching purposes, it remained unbeatable, not to mention the cheapest competition broom on the market. Harry glanced at the field, recalling how, in potions class, first years paired off to fashion their cauldrons out of pewter, basic, reliable, and far from top shelf. It mirrored the meteor's place in the broom hierarchy. He still didn't understand why Cosmic Broom Company went under in 1978. Every meteor he'd ever flown worked like a dream. Earlier, Ryan had explained it away. The company got tired of the entry-level market and tried to square off against giants like the Sweep Broom Company and Comet Trading. The gamble had clearly backfired. Harry pressed his foot gently against the rear bristles. The broom held steady before hovering a foot above the ground. The familiar slight tremor of awakening magic ran up the handle. He closed his eyes, let out a deep breath, and inched back the pressure. The meteor surged forward, carrying him smoothly along the practice pitch. As the wind whispered through his hair, Harry smiled to himself. Sometimes the simplest, most dependable magic was the best of all. Cosmic Broom Co. had poured substantial R&D funds into merging the rugged safety of the Old Oak arrows with the nimble control of the premier sweep series. In the end, however, the project fell flat. Unlike the Quidditch-obsessed founders of its competitors, the company's owner treated flying broom technology purely as a profit opportunity. When the prototype failed to deliver quick returns, he refused to authorize further investment. 10 years later, facing stagnant sales, he quietly declared bankruptcy. Yet out of that collapse came the foundation for the Nimbus 1000. Devlin Whitehorn, a talented engineer at Cosmic Broom, resigned in frustration when research funding was cut. Undeterred, he used his own savings to continue developing his broom design. To support himself, he entered broom racing competitions all across Europe, putting each prototype through its paces under real-world conditions. Whitehorn's relentless dedication finally paid off in 1966 when he unveiled the Nimbus 1000, capable of reaching 100 miles per hour and executing a flawless 360-degree turn anywhere in midair. It set a new standard for speed and agility in the world of Quidditch. The Nimbus Racing Broom Company had been founded in one Whitehorn, which is why, after passing Roger's flying test and with Professor Flitwick's blessing, Harry opted for the Nimbus 2000 instead of the Sweep 7. His choice only heightened his fame across the houses, so much so that Harry really didn't feel like leaving his bed this morning. Even up in the Ravenclaw common room, he couldn't escape notice. A clutch of eager upperclassmen, convinced that Voldemort was still at Lar, and pinning all their hopes on him, hovered around Harry, each itching to pass along their own secret broom-handling tips. Among them was a tall, blonde chaser named Henry, strong, straightforward, and brimming with self-confidence. Harry wasn't the least bit surprised by Henry's bold recognition. After all, a Nimbus 2000 rider was never exactly invisible. Chapter 133, Poseidon's Staff. At 10 o'clock that morning in the Ravenclaw dormitory, Harry lay sprawled on his bed, unwilling to move. Everyone except Ron understood why he refused to join the day's bustle downstairs. Even Anthony, Harry's new younger brother by magical adoption, had quietly fetched a few meat pies and a glass of milk from the Great Hall and set them on Harry's bedside table. Since Ron was still camped out in the room, Harry couldn't bring himself to thank him face to face. He nibbled at the pies and sipped the now cold milk whenever Ron slipped out, hoping to rally the crowds of curious students in the corridor. Ron hadn't been this popular since he won that Quidditch match. He darted back and forth, brimming with excitement and eager to parade Harry as his prize. Just then, the dormitory door swung open. Hermione Granger marched in, her cheeks flushed and her hands on her hips. Harry bolted upright. "Hermione, what are you doing here? You know girls aren't allowed in the boys' dorm." Hermione's eyes blazed at him. "Actually, Harry, you're in the girls' wing of Ravenclaw Tower. Boys aren't supposed to be here. Have you forgotten the layout?" She glanced around at the 4 beds lining the polished floor. Each headboard bore a name engraved in gleaming gold letters. One name caught her eye: Ronald Bilious Weasley. Hermione drew in a sharp breath. She gave Ron a withering look. "Care to explain why you've rearranged the dormitory, and why you've invited half the school in here to fawn over Harry?" Ron shuffled his feet, cheeks coloring as he tried for a sheepish grin. "Well, I thought, why not keep Harry right here, safe and sound, so everyone can see how heroic he was?" Harry closed his eyes and let out a long sigh. The pies on the bedside table looked more appealing than ever. Hermione crossed her arms. "You can't just claim the Ravenclaw dormitory as your own mini crowd zone, Ron. We'll all get in trouble." Ron rubbed the back of his neck and threw an apologetic glance at Harry. "Sorry, mate. I got carried away." Harry sat up and reached for a still warm slice of pie. "Thanks for wanting to help, Ron, but let's get out of here before a prefect turns this place upside down." Hermione released a relieved breath. "Agreed. Now let's go, before anyone else shows up." With that, the 3 of them slipped out of the crowded, but now suddenly empty dorm room, ready to face whatever the day would bring. While Harry, and even Neville, avoided getting tangled up in other people's affairs, Sage seemed to thrive on it. He even cornered Harry the other day with an enthusiastic grin. "I've decided to publish a book," he announced as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Before Harry could respond, Hermione cut in. "Harry, look who's here. It's Ron." Harry blinked. "Yes, but what am I forgetting?" Hermione's eyes flashed, her frustration as palpable as a long-haired cat arching its back. "Look beside you," she hissed, pointing to the empty bed next to Ryan's. Topics of Atlantis couldn't be spoken aloud, and with Ryan absent and unable to serve as any kind of messenger, Hermione had no choice but to gesture wildly. Harry slapped his forehead. "Of course, Ryan!" Hermione crossed her arms, frowning. "What does that have to do with him? He never stands out, and he keeps to himself. If it weren't for that one surprising incident, we wouldn't even know he existed." Seeing Hermione's anger, Harry decided not to reveal the strange rules he'd lately pieced together, how Ryan could seemingly bend people's perception of his very existence. It also explained why Harry had completely dropped the subject of Atlantis. Ryan's subtle shielding cast a veil over his memory. Outside, the sun shone brightly on the soaring towers of the ancient castle deep within Nottingham Forest, its presence hidden from ordinary muggles, its secrets safe in the quiet afternoon light. A lone figure materialized before the castle gates, and the doors swung open of their own accord. Just inside, a small creature with bulbous, glowing eyes stood respectfully, head bowed. "Master Ryan, your scepter is ready," announced the house elf Jack, extending a slender hand that held a perfectly clear crystal rod. Within it shimmered the deep blue of the ocean. Ryan examined the mock nautical artifact with a satisfied nod. "Not bad at all. It looks impressive enough." He paused, then touched the delicate necklace that Kate had given him. "I'll be using both this scepter and Kate's pendant soon." His plan was simple. He needed to shepherd Harry and Hermione to the lost city of Atlantis, but he didn't want to shatter the illusion by plunging them straight to the ocean floor. Nor did he care to rely on his Skywalker Alchemy Workshop's famous Anywhere door. Too easy, too predictable. Instead, he'd commissioned Jack to craft these magical props, each designed to awe onlookers and conceal their true method of travel. Kate's necklace, Ryan smiled, held its own clever secret. With everything in place, Ryan turned toward the castle interior. Atlantis awaited, and the real magic was about to begin. Ryan decided to let Kate watch, too. He wanted her to feel included again and to forget any lingering annoyance over his standing her up last week. "All right, that's settled," he said, a faint smile on his lips, and vanished into thin air. Not far away in the Gryffindor dormitory, Harry and Hermione were deep in conversation when a voice silently echoed in their minds. "Harry, Hermione, come out now. No one will notice you. Meet me by the Black Lake." "It's Ryan," Hermione breathed, her eyes lighting up. "Come on, Harry, let's go." "Easy for you to say," Harry grumbled as he tugged at his robes. "How am I supposed to change if we sprint off right this second?" A few minutes later, they slipped out of the castle and made their way toward the gate. Strangely, the other students and teachers barely registered their passing, or perhaps they chose to step aside instinctively, as though some subtle magic compelled them to ignore Harry and Hermione. Hermione hardly noticed. She was too eager to reach the lake's edge and dive down to uncover whatever awaited them at the bottom. Harry, by contrast, felt an all-too-familiar pang of invisibility. Just like the days in primary school before Hogwarts, when no one wanted to befriend him thanks to Dudley's reputation. Yet even that odd sensation couldn't dampen his curiosity. Something about Ryan's summons promised an adventure they couldn't refuse. Harry felt strangely exhilarated, so much so that he unconsciously slowed his pace. Ouch, my shoes come off. He realized that Hermione had stepped on the heel of his oversized shoe, keeping it from falling completely behind. Ever since he'd been a child, Harry had worn Dudley's hand-me-down clothes, always choosing the largest size, shoes included, which explained why they never fit quite right. "Sorry, Harry. Hurry up," Hermione said with a quick apology, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. They pressed on until they reached the shore of the Black Lake. Though it was only early September, a biting cold had settled over the castle grounds. The surrounding hills were washed in gray, some trees stood bare, and the usual flash of colorful fish near the water's edge was nowhere to be seen. Hermione rubbed her hands together, trying to warm them. "Why is nobody here?" she wondered aloud. "No, look at the lake," Harry said. He still struggled to see clearly without the tape on his glasses, but his sharp eyesight picked out something unexpected, a swirling whirlpool rotating just beyond the shoreline. After 10 seconds, the churning water in the whirlpool steadied into a slender, transparent column. Two figures slid silently down its glassy surface and stepped onto the deck. Hermione stared at the second newcomer, about her height, clad in Hogwarts robes bearing the Ravenclaw crest, and turned to Ryan. "Ryan, who's she?" Leaning casually on his crutches, Ryan offered a warm smile. "This is Kate Lewinster, a fifth-year Ravenclaw. I'm sure you remember her. She's the only student from Hogwarts who's ever been to Atlantis." Harry studied Kate's expression, as frosty and unreadable as the deepest ocean trench. He realized, with a sudden jolt, how she'd known Madame Pomfrey wasn't in the infirmary that Wednesday afternoon, and why she'd gone searching there in the first place. It dawned on him that what had started as just Hermione and him had quietly grown into a party of four. And, given how effortlessly charming Ryan was, Harry mused that it was hardly surprising the boy's smiles had won everyone over. Clearing his throat, Harry gestured toward the ornate scepter Ryan held. "So, what exactly is that?" Ryan held it up proudly. "The Staff of Poseidon. With it, we can travel through any body of water, sea, river, even a simple puddle. Nothing's off limits." Harry exchanged a look with Hermione, excitement and a touch of trepidation dancing in his eyes. Atlantis, it seemed, was only the beginning. "We're going to use this to travel to Atlantis," Ryan said, pointing earnestly at the strange device. Beside him, Kate's face remained perfectly calm, but in Ryan's mind her laughter echoed like thunder. Chapter 134, The Legend of the Three Brothers. It was 10:50 p.m. Four young wizards stood at the edge of the frigid lake, steam rising from the dark water under the moonlight. In Hermione's trembling hand, the ancient scepter thrummed with power, its ornate tip summoning a wave that rippled across the surface as if drawn from the Bermuda Triangle itself. Hermione, Muggle-born and well aware of how far that mysterious stretch of ocean lay from Scotland, could hardly believe her own eyes. Harry's mouth fell open, astonished. Beside him, Kate folded her arms and scowled in frustration, her cheeks pink from the cold. Only Ryan, the oldest of the four, remained composed. He raised his cane and offered Hermione an encouraging smile. "Hermione," he said softly, "do you remember what I told you?" "Magic is a miracle," he had explained. "The first step in learning it is believing you can perform the impossible. You might not be able to do it yet," he'd told her, "but that only means you haven't decided you can." Hermione drew a steadying breath and nodded. Gently, Ryan reached out and ruffled her hair. Harry quickly diverted his gaze to the moon's reflection, dancing on the water. Kate's pout deepened, though the slight upturn at the corner of her lips betrayed her amusement. Then a spark lit in Harry's eyes. "Resurrection," he whispered. "Can we bring someone back to life?" Ryan chuckled, tapping the frozen ground with his cane. "If we're talking resurrection," he said, "we must begin with the oldest story of them all. It comes from the Tales of Beedle the Bard, one of the most beloved collections in the wizarding world." He cleared his throat and began. The Tales of Beedle the Bard is a set of moral fables written centuries ago for young witches and wizards. Passed down from generation to generation, these stories have long served as a beloved bedtime ritual in magical families. "Harry, Hermione," Ryan said, turning to his two companions, "you only need to ask any Hogwarts student later. Everyone here knows the tales of the Hopping Pot or the Fountain of Fair Fortune, as well as Muggle children know Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty." He caught Harry's anxious glance and Hermione's skeptical frown. "Okay, let me cut to the chase. I'm talking about the legend of the three brothers and Death himself." "Death?" Hermione interrupted, eyes wide. "A god of death? Surely not, unless he was a wizard. We're always inventing new spells. How could such a thing exist?" Ryan gave her a patient smile. "Hermione, you're brilliant, but sometimes you're just too narrow-minded and short-sighted. Look at the Patronus charm. Andros, a wizard from ancient Greece, hardly advanced by our standards, managed to summon a Patronus of colossal size. And remember Nicholas Flamel over 600 years ago? He created the most powerful alchemical artifact in history, the Philosopher's Stone. He brewed the elixir of life and turned ordinary metals into gold. Magic grows, yes, but sometimes the greatest feats come from long ago, not tomorrow. So far, Nicholas Flamel and his wife Perenelle remain very much alive, living in seclusion somewhere in France. Countless alchemical families still devote their entire fortunes to recreating the Philosopher's Stone, which is precisely why French alchemy stands head and shoulders above the rest. These wizards may seem archaic by modern standards, Ryan said solemnly, flipping the chocolate frog card between his fingers. Hermione's eyes narrowed. But Nicholas Flamel, a fabrication? How could that be? Dumbledore's record speaks for itself. He defeated Grindelwald in 1945, discovered 12 uses for dragon's blood, and achieved groundbreaking success in alchemy alongside Flamel. Hermione, please, Harry interjected, tone sharp. According to this card, word for word, Nicholas Flamel still lives. He shot Ryan a look. You were saying? Ryan placed the card down. Some speculate that Nicholas Flamel is not one man, but a title, passed to the most gifted wizard of each generation in the Flamel line. Hermione shook her head. That's pure conjecture. Enough, Hermione, Harry cut in. Don't challenge what you've never seen. He leaned forward, voice low but intense. Immortality is no fairy tale. A phoenix is, after all, an immortal magical creature. If even a fraction of its life-renewing power could be harnessed through alchemy, imagine what a living Flamel could do. Even the Muggle world has discovered an immortal creature, the Turritopsis dornae jellyfish. By reverting its cells to an earlier state and repeating its life cycle indefinitely, it can, in effect, live forever. Yet, as remarkable as that sounds, it isn't a magical being, Ryan emphasized as he glanced around the classroom. All right, he said, letting his gaze linger on Harry. Now I'll finish the tale of the three brothers. Listen closely. This is where myth becomes legend. When the three brothers first met Death at the edge of a dark river, they were no ordinary magicians. By combining cunning and powerful enchantments, they had slipped past his grasp. Amused and grudgingly respectful, Death appeared before them and offered each a gift of his choosing. The eldest brother, proud and warlike, demanded a wand more potent than any other, a wand that would guarantee its owner victory in every duel. With a flourish, Death produced a branch from an elder tree and fashioned it into what we now call the Elder Wand. The second brother, arrogant and burning with resentment, wanted to humiliate Death himself. He asked for the power to recall the dead back to life. Death, indifferent to mockery, merely picked up a plain, unassuming stone and imbued it with the ability to resurrect the departed, though with consequences the brother did not foresee. Harry, you'll want to remember this part. Finally, the third brother, far wiser than his siblings, sensed Death's ill intent in these grand gifts. Instead of seeking power or glory, he simply asked for something that would allow him to go about unseen. With a huff, Death handed over his own cloak of deepest midnight. Under it, the brother walked freely, hidden from Death's eyes, and thus escaped him for many years. Eventually, the third brother put aside the cloak, greeting Death as an old friend, and departed this world on his own terms. And there it is, the origin of the three fabled objects, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Invisibility Cloak, which together came to be known as the Deathly Hallows. Ryan paused. That's the story as it's told in the ancient manuscripts. Whether you believe every detail is up to you. But remember, legends often hold a kernel of truth, and somewhere out there, those three artifacts may still exist. Harry sat back, his mind racing. A single question pulsed at the edge of his thoughts. Which one of those hallows did he truly need? He made only one request, that Death should never find him. Death, with obvious reluctance, removed his own cloak of invisibility and handed it over. In the end, the eldest brother truly was invincible, on the battlefield, at least, but he remained a mere mortal once the fighting was done. One night, far from home in a back-alley tavern, someone slipped the wand from under his cloak and slit his throat. The second brother could not bear the loss of his love. He begged for the power to call her back, and she did return, but a cold distance lay between them, as if a veil of sand separated her soul from the world of the living. She walked and spoke among men, yet she no longer belonged. Driven by grief, He ended his own life so that at last they might be together. The third brother, tired of outwitting death, quietly laid aside his own invisibility cloak. He embraced his young son, whispered his farewell, and then greeted death as an old friend, stepping from life without a struggle. When Ryan finished the tale, Hermione and Harry sat perfectly still, scarcely daring to draw breath. Beside them, Kate's eyes danced. She was already reaching out to Ryan with her mind, ready to begin her next mental sparring match. Harry sat back and studied his companions. So the Eld, or wand, can make its wielder all but unbeatable. The resurrection stone really does bring the dead back, but those spirits only long to die again, forever out of place among the living. And the invisibility cloak renders you truly unseen. Wear it constantly, and it's like drinking an elixir of immortality. You simply never grow old or die. He touched his chin, lost in thought. At that moment, the cold draft in the room vanished, and a gentle warmth settled around them, as if the very air had been transformed. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry caught a flicker of movement, a bright dancing line of text along the edge of the page before them. Chapter not finished. Click here to read more. He blinked and frowned. Ignore it, he said. Probably just another of Ryan's pranks. Hermione leaned forward, her eyes bright. Is that really all the evidence we have? Isn't there more? Harry shot her a warning look. Patience, he murmured. Then he drew a deep breath and began again. The legend of the Elder Wand rests on one unforgiving rule. To claim it, you must take it from its rightful master. Egbert the Wicked learned this when he murdered Emeric the Evil and seized the wand for himself. Years later, a man named Godlot met his end in the damp darkness of his own cellar. His own son, Hereward, had crept in under cover of night and stolen the wand away. He paused, letting the weight of the tale sink in. Hermione sat absolutely still, her gaze fixed on him, waiting for what would come next. Chapter text. Whispers of the Hallows. Traces of the Hallows weave through every page of our magical history, Ryan said, leaning forward with a half-smile. Take the Resurrection Stone, for example. It once belonged to Gunter, a supposed descendant of Salazar Slytherin, before vanishing without a trace. And the Invisibility Cloak. Harry, you know that one best. It remained in the Potter family for generations, only to surface recently in Albus Dumbledore's possession. A stunned hush fell over the group. Lee's heart pounded as she paced the floor. No, it can't be. If the cloak really exists, and if Dumbledore has it, then my parents, they might have survived. And Rita Skeeter's slanders about Dumbledore? None of it would have stuck if people knew he was on friendly terms with Nicholas Flamel. She paused, brow furrowed. It all makes sense now. Dumbledore's advanced in years, and he and Flamel have clashed over how best to protect the cloak. He must have taken it into his own hands, believing only he could keep it safe. Hermione stepped forward, voice earnest. Ryan, you know that can't be the whole story. Dumbledore doesn't hoard powerful artifacts for himself. He's always put others first. Ryan shrugged, eyes cool. Believe what you will, but before you pledge your loyalty, you ought to hear exactly what happened that fateful night. Ryan frowned as he flipped through the battered parchment in his hands. So Dumbledore actually borrowed the invisibility cloak from your parents just so he could examine it? Hermione nodded. Yes, but back then, my parents' house was already protected by the Fidelius charm. It made the cloak superfluous. The Fidelius charm? Ryan echoed, glancing at her in surprise. I thought that was impossible to cast. Hermione set the parchment aside and leaned forward. The Fidelius charm conceals a secret deep within a single person's soul, the secret keeper. As long as the keeper doesn't divulge it, no one, no thief, spy, or dark wizard can discover the hidden information. You can't apparate to the location, you can't locate it with magic, and you certainly can't stumble upon it by accident. Ryan's eyes widened. That is incredible. I've studied a lot of advanced spells, but I've never actually seen a successful Fidelius charm. Even most Hogwarts professors reckon it's beyond anyone but Dumbledore. Hermione shrugged. That would explain why he was the one they asked. And if any other order members or safe houses could benefit from such protection, they'd have used it. Especially after Dumbledore's death, when everyone was worried about finding and protecting Harry. Ryan tapped his chin thoughtfully. So if your parents were already hidden behind the Fidelius, the invisibility cloak really was just an extra reassurance. Exactly. Hermione offered him a small, wry smile. But you can't fault Dumbledore for covering every angle, especially when it comes to my family's safety. Ryan tucked the parchment into his robes, still impressed. Well, I'll never underestimate the power of a properly cast Fidelius charm again. He paused, then added with a grin, and I won't question another request from Professor Dumbledore, no matter how strange it sounds. Chapter 135, Necklace. At 11:15 p.m., by the shore of the Black Lake, an ugly mermaid's head bobbed above the water, its beady eyes scanning the bank. It paid no attention to Ryan and the 4 students standing before it. Harry took a deep breath. Wait, if the Fidelius charm is truly that powerful, then whoever held the secret must have been the one to betray my parents. Ryan, do you know who the secret keeper was? Ryan hesitated, then said, if you dig through the old newspapers, they all point to Sirius Black as the secret keeper. Harry's face went pale. But he was never tried. He was sent straight to Azkaban. Doesn't that seem strange? It always bothered me, Ryan admitted. After Voldemort's fall, Black hunted down Peter Pettigrew, your father's other friend. He found Pettigrew dead, laughed hysterically over his remains, and when the Aurors arrived, he didn't even try to resist. He was arrested without a trial? Harry repeated, incredulous. Hermione's eyes went wide. The Ministry of Magic could just do that? In that moment, the young witch felt the world's darkness press in around her for the very first time. Ryan leaned back, folding his arms with the air of a man who'd been waiting exactly for this moment. Harry met his gaze. Ryan, you keep saying no one knows where the Grim Reaper's 3 gifts are hidden, but something tells me you're not being honest. What are you leaving out? There was a glint of amusement in Ryan's eyes. All right, he said finally, the 3 gifts, the Elder Wand, the Resurrection Stone, and the Invisibility Cloak, once belonged to the Peverell brothers, Antioch, Cadmus, and Ignotus. Harry's brow rose. Ryan continued, I'm descended from Antioch, the eldest. The Gaunt family, Salazar Slytherin's line, carries Cadmus's blood. And you, Harry, are a direct descendant of Ignotus Peverell. Harry's heart pounded. Ryan raised a hand, halting his questions. But don't think I'm going to hand you a full map to the Hollows. Our friend Smith knows more about their locations than anyone alive. I can tell you where 2 of them rest, but not the Invisibility Cloak. Harry leaned forward. Which 2? Ryan smiled, savoring the tension. The Resurrection Stone, your prize, is locked deep within a vault, teeming with magical wards and deadly traps. Even a wizard at Dumbledore's level would have to risk everything to retrieve it. Harry clenched his fists on the table. So when will you tell me more? And what about Atlantis? Weren't we supposed to head there next? Ryan's grin widened, as though he'd just delivered news that could set the wizarding world ablaze. Patience, Harry. All in good time. And Atlantis can wait until we've decided whether you're truly ready to claim your birthright. Harry's heart pounded as the truth struck him. Their second goal, after surviving this year, was still the Philosopher's Stone. It remained the only hope to vanquish the still-living Voldemort. Suddenly, the legend of Atlantis, the source of Ryan's prodigious power, took on even greater importance in Harry's mind. Hermione, cheeks flushed, snapped back to reality. She realized she'd been utterly distracted by Ryan's calm confidence and the gentle timbre of his voice. All right, Harry, Hermione, Kate, Ryan said, folding his arms. Before we embark, we need a little insurance, something to ensure no one notices we've vanished. He reached inside his wizard's robe and produced a simple necklace, a fine chain holding a multifaceted crystal. Kate's lips curved in a fond smile. It was the unassuming birthday gift her mother had given her on her 11th birthday. Don't let its simplicity fool you, Ryan continued. This charm can create temporary doubles of us. The magical energy comes straight from me, so you won't lose any power. They'll last about an hour before dissipating. He tapped the crystal, and a warm golden beam shot out, settling on the grass. Within moments, 4 indistinct figures materialized, featureless silhouettes that hovered in the air. Harry, Hermione, Kate, meet your stand-ins, Ryan announced. These copies will keep everyone occupied until we're back. He smiled at their astonished faces, then slung the necklace back into his robe pocket. Now, let's get moving. Time's not on our side. I'm sorry, but I can't help with that. Okay, Ryan said, leaning in with a conspiratorial look. Here's the plan. Leave your original bodies exactly where they are. Use the doppelgangers to move around. Head to the common room, the dormitory, anywhere we won't draw attention. Harry nodded. Got it. We'll wait here. Controlling their mirror images, the other four slipped back through Hogwarts' front gate. They climbed the worn stone steps, pushed through the heavy wooden doors, and hurried down the echoing corridors. 10 minutes later, the originals, lying on the grass beside the lake, opened their eyes in unison. Ryan stood and stretched. All right, let's go. He turned to Harry and Hermione with a mischievous smile. By the way, have you ever tried the slide here? It might feel familiar. Harry's stomach lurched. He'd heard rumors of a secret passage hidden beneath the lake. Ryan lifted his wand and pointed at the water. The surface rippled, then split open, forming a circular portal. Harry stared, uncertain. What? Go on, Ryan urged, tossing a glance at the watching duplicates. Be the first to jump. With a breathless nod, Harry stepped forward and plunged into the shimmering hole. The world went silent. Under Ryan's watchful eye, Hermione closed her own duplicate's eyes and followed. They fell through darkness, into whatever lay beyond the lake's hidden gateway. Careful, you're off balance. Ryan's wand was already raised when Hermione's vision swam back into focus. She realized with a jolt that she'd nearly toppled straight into the lake beside the glowing portal. Before she could even scream, Ryan caught her by the shoulders, levitating her a foot above the water's surface. Hermione's cheeks burned with mortification as she blinked up at him. No sooner had the words "thank you" formed on her lips than Ryan gave a quiet flick of his wand. Hermione felt herself fall forward, and then she was gone, swallowed by the swirling vortex. Her startled cry cut off abruptly. Kate laughed softly and leaned into Ryan's side, fingertips brushing the silver necklace she'd entrusted to him. You're terrible, she teased, and then, with a playful tilt of her head, and I love it. Ryan draped an arm possessively around her shoulders. Good, he murmured, because it's just you and me now. Kate hesitated. But shouldn't we follow? The two young wizards, Hermione and her companion, are on their own. Won't they be scared without us? I control this passage, Ryan assured her, voice low. If we leave in 2 hours, we'll still arrive in Atlantis just behind them. It's perfectly timed, and for such a long journey, a little extra caution is only natural. He smiled down at her. In the next heartbeat, they vanished, leaving the portal's light to dance alone on the water. At the same moment, the rift in the lake's surface slowly sealed itself, leaving the water perfectly calm once more. Chapter 136. Journey to the Seabed. While Ryan and Kate spent a quiet afternoon tucked into a little London bookstore, curled up together in a corner, lost in the pages of their favorite novels, Harry and Hermione hurtled headlong into the most astonishing adventure of their lives. Harry's cry echoed through the water, then vanished into a deep, unsettling silence. He paddled furiously, expecting Hermione's voice to answer him. But there was nothing, only the faint aftertaste of his own scream reverberating in his ears. Even the recollection of Hermione beside him slipped away, as if it had never been. Moments, or perhaps hours, passed before Harry managed to quell his panic and take stock of his surroundings. Sunlight filtered down through the wavering surface above, casting pale shafts of light across the sea floor. Its glow was beautiful but bone-chilling, offering no real warmth. Strange, iridescent fish drifted by, jellyfish pulsed in ghostly blues, and delicate corals bloomed like underwater gardens, their colors vivid against the gloom. Harry let himself be soothed, however briefly, by their silent company. Cautiously, he reached out and laid his hand on the wall of the cavern they'd fallen into. It felt unexpectedly warm, nothing like the cold, crushing grip of seawater. His fingertips pressed in gently, and the surface gave back, almost springy, as though it were living flesh rather than stone. Harry drew back and peered into the dim corridor beyond. No sign of Hermione, no glimmer of a familiar landmark, just the silent swell of the sea and the unsettling promise of whatever lay in wait deeper still. Harry had been sliding down the pipe for so long that, by rights, the friction should have scorched his trousers, or at least warmed them noticeably. Yet, inexplicably, his pants still felt outrageously silky against the metal, a sensation that was oddly pleasurable and slightly embarrassing to admit. He fought the urge to close his eyes and lose himself entirely in that rare, electrifying feeling, the smooth curve of the pipe pressing against his backside as he flew onward. From the blur of his surroundings, he guessed he must be moving at an incredible speed. At this rate, he could cross the highlands of Scotland and emerge near the Bermuda Triangle off Florida's peninsula in just a few days, a feat no ordinary slide could accomplish. Harry patted his pockets and found the half-eaten pie Anthony had slipped him back in the Great Hall. He tried to estimate how long his rations would last. After all, the rule of thumb was that a person could survive nearly a week without food, but only a few days without water. He wondered if the thin film of condensed moisture clinging to the pipe's walls might quench his thirst. And what would happen if he needed to relieve himself? The pipe's diameter barely accommodated his body. There was no room to stop or brace himself. The interior was too slick to slow down or pull up short. And so, with nothing to hold on to but his own wild thoughts, Harry continued to soar through that impossible tunnel, sliding deeper into mystery, one smooth inch at a time. Harry clung to his faith in Ryan, but the unbroken silence and crushing confinement gnawed at his hope. Left alone in that narrow pipe, his mind drifted back to his earliest memories of solitude. Himself, a scrawny 7-year-old, crammed beneath the Dursleys' stairs. There, spiders had been his only companions, skittering in the corners of the cupboard and comforting him in their own silent way. He'd long ago given them names and whispered to them as he lay wide-eyed in the dark. Now, alone once more, Harry found himself doing the same, murmuring half-remembered stories to the shadows, assigning nicknames to the shapes dancing in the dim light. Exhaustion finally overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. Hermione's experience was different. Time seemed to pass more quickly for her. Whereas Harry felt every agonizing second, Hermione only recalled an echo of her fear. At first, she screamed until her throat went raw. Awe, then, curiosity getting the better of her panic, she reached out and pressed her palm against the pipe's inner surface. She traced its smooth, metallic seam and wondered what alloys and enchantments comprised it. She'd visited aquariums before, but the real ocean's riot of life, schools of phosphorescent fish, scuttling crabs, drifting anemones, was infinitely more fascinating than any glass-walled exhibit. In that narrow tube, surrounded by unnatural stillness, she longed for a glimpse of true marine wonder. Kate had been poring over the dusty tomes for so long that her eyes were beginning to glaze. Just as tedium threatened to overwhelm her, she drifted off without warning. When she woke again, the clock on Ryan's wrist gleamed 12 a.m. sharp. They were seated in the cavernous back room of an uncharted London library. Its shelves vanished into shadows. Kate jabbered questions at Ryan while flipping hurriedly through a leather-bound volume. He responded, good-naturedly teasing her whenever she got flustered. Their laughter echoed among the stacks, but there were only so many minutes before the spell wore off. Ryan shot her a quick glance, noting the time. 12:34 and change. He stood, reached out, wordlessly inviting her to follow. Kate snapped the book shut, rubbed her eyes, and took his hand. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. When they opened their eyes again, they stood shoulder-deep in a long, arched tunnel that snaked through the seabed. A faint, ethereal blue glow suffused the walls, as though they'd passed through some invisible membrane. Then, the tunnel ended, and before them lay the ocean floor of the Bermuda Triangle. Rising out of the pale sands was a colossal, flat-topped pyramid, its surface smooth and translucent like sea glass. From its apex plunged a thick pipe that writhed and coiled like a giant sea serpent. Two figures stirred at the base of the pyramid, Harry and Hermione, roused from an unnaturally deep slumber. Harry sat up, blinking blearily, his hand drifting to his stomach. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "You two arrived early, or is it still nighttime?" He cast a puzzled look around the sunless depths, trying to make sense of where and when they all found themselves. Harry stepped forward and stared in wonder at the crystal-clear pyramid rising before them. He'd seen illustrations of it in old tomes, but never one like this, with its perfectly flat summit, as if the peak had been sheared away. "Is this Atlantis?" Hermione breathed, her eyes fixed on the gleaming structure. Before either of them could speak again, the ground beneath their feet tilted, and in less than a minute they were sliding smoothly into the heart of the pyramid. They emerged into a vast city encased under its own cerulean sky, the sunlight warm but never blistering. Every corridor and chamber was fashioned from translucent, glass-like material, slick and almost frictionless. All around them floated enormous bubbles, their surfaces rippling with pearly hues like scattered pomegranate seeds. Inside some of these shimmering orbs lay rolling meadows dotted with wildflowers and ancient trees. Magical creatures of every ilk roamed those enchanted pastures, fortune-tellers hunched over crystal balls, bow-truckles peering out from knotholes, hairy crabs skittering among the roots, mischievous tree monkeys swinging through the branches, and frogs in jewel-colored cloaks. Flocks of escape birds and silent birds flitted overhead, while fairies danced on petals. In the distance, moon-crazy beasts lumbered past, pangroks burrowed in soft earth, and fantastical mounts, talisman horses, nickered beside sleek Iserons and iridescent glailings. Even thestrals drifted through the haze, their pale shapes half visible against the glowing sky. Other bubbles revealed a sunlit ocean floor. Wizards and merfolk glided through the water, their heads encased in glassy, fishbowl-shaped helmets. Colorful coral reefs curved around them like living sculptures, and schools of tiny fish danced in crystalline currents. Near one reef, mermaids cooed playf, ully, as they guided young grindylows. Water demons kept on short, kelp-like leashes through a game of shell-catching. The creatures splashed and barked like puppies, snatching barnacle-encrusted shells and surrendering them with joyous chirps. Harry and Hermione exchanged astonished looks. The pyramid was no mere ruin, but an entire world of wonder, waiting to be explored. Each bubble they passed through revealed a completely different world. Some served as arenas for underwater competitions, others were Quidditch stadiums suspended in midair, and still others contained little more than rare plants. A few looked like sun-scorched deserts, while some resembled misty rainforests. Below the floating city, on the land still in view, Harry and Hermione spotted an astonishing array of flying contraptions that went far beyond simple brooms. There were fish-tank-shaped carriages, great mechanical sharks and dolphins, enchanted carpets, and even floating toilets, sofas, and beds drifting lazily among the clouds. Equally surprising were the people themselves. Harry and Hermione had never seen clothing fashioned from such materials. The closest thing they'd encountered was that odd fellow Uric, who wore a living jellyfish as a hat. Here, almost everyone wove kelp fronds, jellyfish tentacles, coral branches, and other sea creature parts into their garments. And their wands? Only a handful were still carved from wood. Most were fashioned instead from bone, coral, or strange glowing crystals. Despite the deliberately slow descent, they tumbled from one marvelous bubble to the next so quickly that it felt as though they never saw enough. Then, as if the final curtain had fallen, they plunged headlong into a vast pool of crystalline liquid, and to their amazement, discovered they could breathe perfectly well beneath its shimmering surface. When they stood, their clothes were completely dry, as if they'd never fallen into the pool. Before Harry or Hermione could say a word, Ryan appeared at the water's edge, a warm smile on his face. Harry, Hermione, welcome to Atlantis. Chapter 137, 12:15 p.m., Bermuda Triangle, Atlantis. The crowd milling around barely registered the four wizards standing off to one side, wizards who weren't even on duty. It wasn't that Ryan had gone out of his way to hide them. After 3 years of their encounters, the Atlantean sorcerers had simply grown used to his presence. Their initial hostility had given way to indifference, and now they offered only the barest acknowledgement of his visits. Contract or no contract, any attempt by Atlantis' magicians to bind or subdue Ryan with control spells proved futile. Even 3 years ago, Ryan's mastery of Phoenix magic rendered their chains as insubstantial as smoke. Physically, he was every bit as formidable, so swift that no spell, however powerful, could ever land. Incompatibility was the true culprit. Their techniques had no purchase on him. That's not to say the Atlantean wizards were weak. Among them were many seasoned sorcerers, including several fifth-level elders whose combined power could have overwhelmed even Dumbledore himself. Were the legendary headmaster to burst onto this scene, he might well find himself outmatched and forced to concede. But today, all eyes were on Ryan, and he alone. Voldemort's body had been warped by dark magic so many times that he no longer looked human. His eyes glowed a permanent blood red. The whites were stained as if filled with gore. His features were blurred and misshapen, like wax melted and remolded into a grotesque mask, and those snake-like crimson irises seemed to pulse with malice. Killing held no hesitation for him. At first, the Atlantean mages, accustomed to the crushing pressures of the deep, had been stunned to face such a relentless wizard. But after countless encounters with Ryan's raids, they'd adapted, learning to expect the unexpected. This time, Ryan hadn't come alone. Alongside Kate, 2 young wizards had arrived on the expedition. In Atlantis, they'd already realized that of the 3, only Ryan was truly formidable. Kate was merely average for her age, and these new recruits seemed no stronger. One in particular wore thick glasses and carried himself with awkward uncertainty, yet his sharp gaze hinted at hidden potential. Harry stood motionless on the cavern floor, his mind reeling from what he'd just seen. Finally, rage and disillusionment broke free. "Damn you, Ron," he spat into the silent tunnel. His 3 companions exchanged resigned looks. They weren't surprised, for Harry's fury tonight was merely the opening act of a far greater storm. After slipping through the hidden passage, Harry reconnected with the clone he'd left behind at Hogwarts. Hermione did the same, and Ryan and Kate remained linked the entire time, never losing contact. At Hogwarts, Harry's duplicate finally ran into Ron, who was currently swamped by a dozen older students, too absorbed in their studies to waste time gossiping. Meanwhile, Hermione had slipped back to the girls' dormitory to unwind and dive back into her latest obsession, researching the sunken city of Atlantis, the legendary Lost Pearl. "Harry, can you hear me?" Hermione's voice crackled over the link, edged with worry. Kate stifled a giggle as, in perfect sync, both the original Harry and his clone bit into juicy slices of watermelon. "Just barely," Harry admitted. "It's driving me nuts, juggling 2 bodies at once. Thank Merlin the one in the common room is lounging on the sofa. At least I can still move freely down here." He glanced around the cavernous, otherworldly hall they'd emerged into. Every surface shimmered with enchantments he couldn't even name. Taking a steadying breath, he turned to Ryan. "All right, where's the library?" Ryan pointed down a winding corridor lined with glowing runes. Harry squared his shoulders. No matter how magnificent this place was, he knew he lacked the power to breach the vault where the resurrection stone lay hidden. Still, if they could find the right tomes on protective wards and ancient charms, they might stand a chance of safeguarding it. Before anyone else thought, take it. He suspected there had to be a far more powerful wizard behind that item, perhaps even the death from the legend of the 3 brothers. Turning to his companions, Ryan said, "All right, I'll get you out of Hogwarts, but I can't just let you go hungry." One of them looked puzzled, so Ryan continued, "Wizards here are incredibly generous. They don't use money. Instead, they trade with points earned through contributions to the city. Basic necessities like food and library access are free. You only spend points on things like personal tutoring, entertainment, rare materials, or premium meals. And don't worry, I've stocked up plenty of points." With that settled, Ryan led the 4 toward what looked like a restaurant, waving and nodding to the wizards they passed. The path underfoot was a single, smooth layer of enchanted clay, no loose boards, stones, or dirt to track mud into their shoes. It was surprisingly spotless, a small convenience granted by magic. All along the street stood the usual emporiums, robes and breathing helmets, those fishbowl-like glass domes, enchanted brooms, and even small flying craft. Between them, dozens of temporary stalls spread out, offering every imaginable trinket and treat. As they walked, Ryan pointed out a few of the more intriguing booths, already planning which delicacies to sample once they reached the restaurant. All of these were homemade magical contraptions, a dragon doll that really flies and hunts like a living creature, a mirror enchanted to perform short-term cosmetic surgeries, a wig woven from transplantable living seaweed, especially popular among Mediterranean wizards and fiercely independent young sorcerers, and even detachable fish gills you could snap onto your neck. "Hermione, what is this place?" she asked Ryan, nodding toward a small shop across the plaza where a cluster of young wizards had gathered. Their appearance was stranger still than their clothes. One shirtless youth sported a thick octopus tentacle in place of a navel. Another had grafted his lower body directly onto a squid's, giving him a merfolk silhouette that reminded Luo of the mermaid role he'd once dreamed of playing. Others had rows of suction cups affixed to their elbows and thighs, as though preparing to climb underwater walls. "This spot is basically a Muggle hair salon," Ryan explained with a chuckle. "Only here, instead of haircuts, they sell transplantable, living organs and body mod grafts for decoration." They wandered past the brightly lit stalls, marveling at each display. Hermione paused before a rack of sculpted wigs, strands of living seaweed grown and shaped to mimic the wearer's favorite hairstyle. "These are intriguing," she said, plucking a dark green braid from its stand. "They remind me of the transplantable seaweed wigs we saw earlier, but far more daring and avant-garde." Ryan crossed his arms and sighed. "That's because this market isn't just for ordinary fashions. Young wizards from all over come here without worrying about making ends meet. They're here to study and experiment, so they buy the animal parts they need, fur, feathers, even bones, and assemble them into whatever they desire." He shook his head in disgust. It's so cruel. Those creatures are killed, their bodies cut apart, all for the sake of novelty." Hermione's eyes flashed. "I might understand if it were for food, but this is nothing but vanity." Her voice brimmed with righteous indignation. She had been raised in a comfortable middle-class home, and her schooling had always emphasized compassion for all living things. Privately, Ryan felt sympathy for her. She wasn't one of those self-righteous activists he'd known back in his old world, the kind who wielded moral certitude against anyone who disagreed. Hermione genuinely cared. Her outrage sprang from earnest concern, not from a desire to score political points. "What you and I find abhorrent," Ryan said gently, "they see quite differently. In their magical culture, these pieces, feathers, scales, even organs, are still considered alive, still imbued with spirit. To them, wearing a dragon's scale isn't just a fashion statement, it's a way to share in the creature's power." He offered Hermione a rueful smile. "It doesn't excuse the cruelty, but it does explain why they do it." Hermione's expression softened as she absorbed his words. She tugged on her scarf and glanced back at the wig she still held. "It doesn't make it any less wrong," she replied quietly, "but I understand better now." Together they moved on, their conversation drifting to other wonders and horrors waiting deeper inside the market's labyrinthine alleys. "Sending them to the wizards is the highest honor we can give," Ryan said, guiding the three of them through the bustling crowd. Before long, they rounded a corner and stopped in front of an enormous building that loomed over the square like a stranded whale. Chapter 138, The Sea King Restaurant. At 12:40 p.m., Ryan and the three kids arrived at the Chum Bucket restaurant, its gleaming exterior sculpted into the shape of a massive whale. A steady stream of patrons flowed in and out, underscoring the place's reputation as Atlantis's hottest dining spot. "Karen," Ryan called, spotting the tall, brown-haired hostess weaving through the crowd. "We've got four Krabby Patty combo meals, please." Karen's mechanical voice responded with a courteous acknowledgement as she tapped the order into her touchscreen console. Inside, the Chum Bucket lived up to its fame. Their signature crab dishes were nothing short of extraordinary, each plate showcasing inventive flavors and impeccable presentation. Founded by Sheldon J. Plankton and his genius computer wife Karen, the restaurant had transformed from a struggling venture into a culinary empire. SpongeBob SquarePants ruled the kitchen as head chef, Squidward Tentacles worked the register with his usual grumpiness, and Patrick Star darted between tables, enthusiastic as ever in his role as waiter. As they followed Karen to their table, Ryan found his mind racing. He still couldn't believe the rumors were true. Mr. Krabs had somehow ended up on the menu, while his daughter Pearl, now a literal whale, had lent her likeness to this place. It felt like the Krusty Krab and the Chum Bucket had merged overnight, leaving Mr. Krabs vanished in the most unsettling way. But for now, Ryan pushed the thought aside. Ahead lay 4 steamy Krabby Patty combos, and whatever answers might come with them. Since Ryan first stumbled across this hidden eatery in the heart of Atlantis, he's made it a habit to drop by whenever he has a spare moment. The food here is that good, enough to draw even the busiest wizard away from home. Today, he settles into his favorite corner booth, bathed in the warm glow of hanging lanterns, and watches the chefs arrange plates of bioluminescent coral jelly. "Ryan," a voice calls out with mock indignation. Sheldon, short, brisk, and clad in a sharp green tunic, strides over. "2 weeks without you. Have we fallen out of favor?" Ryan grins and tilts his head toward a nearby table. Harry, Hermione, and Spence lounge there in plain muggle clothes, blending almost seamlessly with the Atlantean crowd. "If you did, I'd file a formal complaint with Spence right now," he teases. Sheldon sets down a tall glass of seaweed elixir speckled with fizzy-popping beads. Watching Ryan scoop one up, he arches an eyebrow. 11 years old, right?" Ryan nods, slurping the cool, chewy bead through a reusable straw. "That means—" Sheldon pauses, genuinely surprised. "You're off to Hogwarts?" "Exactly," Ryan says, wiping his mouth. "Turning 11 means it's time for my letter. Atlantis Academy is terrific, but you can't beat the history, the castle, the sorting hat." Sheldon chuckles, shaking his head. "I'd swear Wizarding Britain leapt ahead by a century when I saw you last. Still, don't underestimate us here. You've got plenty to learn before you get your wand polished for transfiguration. But go on, chase that broom over the forbidden forest if that's what calls to you." Ryan leans back with a satisfied smile. "I will. Just don't forget me when you're reading about the next head boy in the Daily Prophet." Sheldon salutes him in farewell. "Safe travels, Ryan. And remember, Atlantis always has a table waiting." Chapter X, The Hidden Web of Magic. "Yes, that's the one," Ryan said, settling back on the library's window seat. Harry and Hermione exchanged puzzled glances as he addressed them. "Let me explain why the very walls of Hogwarts are so vital to our magical education." Harry leaned forward. "How do you think we actually learn and master spells?" Hermione answered at once. "By pronouncing the incantation clearly, performing the correct wand movement, and focusing our intent." "Exactly," Ryan nodded. "There are 3 essential components to any successful spell: the incantation itself, the precise wand gesture, and the caster's determination. He paused to let that sink in, then continued. "But have you ever wondered why all 3 must be channeled through a wand? Why speaking the words and waving the stick actually produces magic?" Both shook their heads. "Every time magic is used," Ryan explained, "it leaves an imprint in what I call the magical field. Think of it as an enchanted internet. Each unique spell is like a file saved on that network. The very first witch or wizard to produce a new effect gives it its name and pattern, and that imprint remains in the field forever. When you speak the incantation with perfect pronunciation, flick your wand along the original trajectory, and pour your will into the action, you're essentially retrieving that file and activating it. Hogwarts is built on centuries of these imprints. Every corridor, classroom, and tower brims with residue from spells past. That's why practicing here gives you a deeper connection to the magic itself." Harry and Hermione exchanged amazed looks. Suddenly, the ancient castle around them felt alive in a way they'd never noticed before. A vast, humming library of spells waiting to be rediscovered. Ryan leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. "Back in the old days," he began, "wizards downloaded magic simply by speaking a spell's true name in a specific place and at exactly the right moment. In effect, the universe delivered the magic straight into your mind, just like downloading a file onto your computer." Hermione and Harry exchanged intrigued looks as they listened. Ryan continued, "Because of the interaction between a wizard's innate magical field and the ambient magnetic energies at the site, that first download would actually deepen the spell's imprint in your mind. It made finding, or loading, that spell later far easier, and your casting much faster." Harry raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying we used to learn spells more quickly?" "In a way, yes," Ryan said. "But as magic evolved, the old method became too unpredictable. Spells circulated for centuries, changing in meaning and power. Modern magic, our magic today, requires 3 things: the spell's true name, the precise wand movement that goes with it, and the spellcaster's own focused intent. Think of the wand movement as a password and your intent as the final authentication step." "What does that mean for learning magic?" Hermione asked. "It means that in today's world, picking up a spell isn't just about memorization. You need to master the wand flight path and cultivate the inner determination to make it work." That extra layer of complexity actually makes magic more stable, more reliable, and far less likely to backfire in a dangerous way. Harry nodded thoughtfully. And I suppose that's why ancient schools of magic, places with buildings that have stood for 1,000 years, became the best spots to train. The ley lines and magical residue there are so strong your first attempts take root more naturally. Exactly, Ryan agreed, smiling. It's like completing your education in a perfect laboratory. Hermione fumbled in her robes and produced a sleek Muggle notebook and pen. She'd brought them along just in case. Here, she said, offering them to Harry. You can borrow it, just don't lose it. Harry grinned and carefully took the notebook. Thanks, Hermione. I'm not about to misplace this. There's a lot to remember. Hermione returned to her seat, satisfied. Ryan's explanation had given them a fresh perspective on why Hogwarts and every other magical academy was built where it was. More importantly, they now understood just how much effort and intent lay behind each and every spell. Karen appeared moments later, wheeling in a gilded cart piled high with what she called the Krabby Patty for 4. The name was misleading. This was no humble burger, but a lavish king crab banquet, artfully arranged in 4 distinct preparations. One quadrant was delicately steamed, the next salt-baked to deepen its sweetness. A fragrant curry sauce coated the 3rd section, while the final portion simmered in a rich id stew. Each style boasted its own texture and spice profile, yet none overpowered the others. Instead, they unfolded in sequence, one flavor paving the way for the next. Ryan's eyes had lit up the moment the cart arrived. He'd half hoped for a traditional beef patty, but the sight of those ruby-splashed shells quickly won him over. Hermione, on the other hand, hovered tentatively at the edge of the table, unsure how to begin. But when Harry plunged in without hesitation, scooping up ribbons of tender white meat, she relaxed and followed suit. Right away, they could taste the chef's precision, a bite of guileless sweetness from the steam, the clean saltiness of the bake, the gentle heat of the curry, and finally the earthy warmth of the stew. No matter how full they felt, each layered flavor lured them on, promising, then delivering a new thrill. By the time the last crumb of crab was gone, the clock on the wall read 1:30. With contented sighs, the 4 friends rose from the table and made their way down the corridor toward the library. Outside the grand carved doors, Ryan paused. Harry, Hermione, you're welcome to check out anything you like. But remember, this is a special collection. If someone's not part of our circle, they can browse and read here in the library, but they can't borrow the books. He pushed open the heavy doors, and they stepped into the hushed glow of the reading room. The library before them was vast, its scale and style unlike any ordinary mansion's. Clearly the work of early wizards, it bore none of the isolationist austerity that later generations favored. Instead, grand marble sculptures lined the wide marble causeway. Heroes of old who had first rediscovered a shattered Atlantis, brokered an alliance with the merfolk, rebuilt the lost city, and sealed that pact in magic and stone. Each figure stood on a plinth inscribed in gilded letters, chronicling its deeds for all to read. These people were incredible, Hermione murmured, crouching to read the golden text beneath one statue. Harry, however, was already striding toward the library doors, urgency on his face. Harry, you might as well get the first-year textbook straight from the academy, Ryan called after him. Academy? Harry paused, brow furrowed. You mean Hogwarts? No, Ryan replied, smoothing the sleeve of his robes. Their school is simply called the Academy. Realization dawned on Harry. Right, the Academy. With that, he stepped inside. The interior was hushed and empty of staff. Thousands of books hovered in neat rows, their pages whispering as they turned themselves. Along each spine gleamed a small enchanted metal block, an elegant anti-theft ward that floated just above the visible binding. From floor to vaulted ceiling, the library shimmered in soft blue light, as if the night sky itself had been bottled between the walls and studded with stars. Anytime you ask a question, the books most relevant to it will flutter over and hover within reach. When Harry summoned the Academy's first-year textbooks in his mind, 7 silvery stars slid down from the firmament and formed a circle around him. Each star held a single, plainly titled volume. One read Year 1 Potions, another Year 1 Charms, and so on. Harry could hardly believe his eyes. This is incredible, he whispered. Chapter 139. This too is alchemy. Harry watched with a growing sense of disbelief. Was this really potion-making? The methods at the academy were nothing like what he'd learned at Hogwarts. He couldn't fathom how anyone could call this potion science. At first glance, the procedure resembled cooking more than magic, yet Harry could quickly spot how it diverged from his training. 1. Ingredient preparation. Just as in cooking, every element, except for a few semi-processed compounds requiring immediate refinement, had to be pulverized into powder, minced, or mashed into a paste. Some recipes called for extraction of fresh juices, but Harry's current knowledge hadn't covered that technique. Number 2. Controlled heating. The mixture was heated over a flame while you vigilantly watched for subtle color shifts in the liquid. At precisely the right moment, you added additional ingredients. 3. Regulated stirring. Unlike ordinary cooking, potion stirring was governed by strict rules. You had to turn the spoon a precise number of times, alternating between clockwise and counterclockwise to ensure proper magical activation. 4. The wizard's touch. Every step could be followed by a muggle without error, but without the wizard or witch infusing their own magical energy into the cauldron, the end result was nothing more than a worthless liquid. Harry couldn't help but sigh. He recognized the mechanics, but where was the artistry? The subtle interplay of intent, the layering of enchantments, the true alchemy that turned simple ingredients into something extraordinary, all of that seemed missing here. Still, he forced himself to focus. After all, if this was the Academy's version of potions, he'd better learn their rules before he could bend or break them. Ryan leaned forward, wand tucked casually at his side. "What's more," he explained, "some potions actually require a wand's involvement." He glanced up with a half-smile. "We call that consecration. Quite fitting, don't you think?" In our first year at the Academy, the old alchemy department was even renamed to reflect this new philosophy. From day one, our instructors stressed that every potion is nothing more or less than a ritual uniting the physical properties of ingredients with raw magic. Accordingly, the traditional cauldron has all but vanished from our curriculum. Yes, we still gather herbs, minerals, and various reagents, but the real work now falls to the wizard, not the spoon. No more slow boils or careful stirring. Instead, your own magical presence does all the heavy lifting. Here's the Academy's streamlined method for brewing a potion. 1. Magic immersion. You don't need a wand yet, just your focus. Gaze at your ingredients and imagine them as an extension of yourself. When you truly feel that essence starting to flow, like a small tug or warmth in your fingers, you'll know the immersion is successful. Beginners are encouraged to handle any solid components directly, touch them, picture them as part of your own body, and sense that gentle warmth at your fingertips. 2. Magical extraction. This is where the wand comes in. You channel your spell through it, drawing out the enchanted properties you need. The extraction spell forms the very core of the Academy's potion process. Master these 2 steps, and you'll be brewing Academy-approved potions in no time. No cauldron required. The 3rd step is carried out almost entirely by the Muggles of Atlantis. They take the magic-infused materials, extract their juices or crystallized essences, and blend these precipitated ingredients together. Only the most advanced potions still demand a wizard's involvement. In those cases, a spellcaster must follow the recipe to the letter, and sometimes perform a consecration ritual. The Academy's textbooks describe these consecration incantations in meticulous detail, each one an evolution of Old English or another lost tongue, bearing the true name of the potion. By speaking these ancient words, wizards believe they guide the brew toward its intended purpose before its innate spirit dissipates. Harry stared at the page, eyes wide with wonder. Watching him, Ryan couldn't help but remember how he'd felt the first time he opened this same book. Surprise, tinged with shame. 3 years ago, on his first journey to Atlantis with Kate, Ryan had been brimming with arrogance. He'd skimmed the local journals and dismissed them as mere relative truths, refusing to take their knowledge seriously. Instead, he'd buried himself in the histories he least cared for, oblivious to the wisdom he was ignoring. Ryan halted in front of a street-side potion shop and peered through the window. To his astonishment, the ground-floor warehouse was staffed entirely by muggles and squibs, no wands in sight. They measured ingredients by weight, stirred cauldrons by hand, and packed the finished brews into plain glass bottles. In that moment, Ryan felt a pang of both surprise and shame. Here was the mighty realm of Atlantis, reduced to this humble, labor-intensive operation. He was deep into the rebuilding of his ancestral seat, now dubbed Smith Castle, and the project was bleeding his coffers dry. Every gold galleon saved by his forebears was nearly spent. His original plan had been cautious: carry on the old defenses in case a concealment ritual failed, sneak out occasionally to mingle in the real world, then strike back once his strength was restored. But the restoration had proven far more expensive than he'd anticipated. Watching those non-magical workers pumping out simple tonics, pepper repastilles, Wiggenweld remedies, Skelegro substitutes, Ryan's mind raced. If Muggles could mass-produce basic potions without wands, why couldn't he? A little confundus charm on the factory managers, a discreet outsourcing contract in a developing nation, and he could flood the market with high-demand elixirs. Steady sales, minimal oversight, virtually endless gold. He kicked himself for not seeing it sooner. With that strategy, he wouldn't have had to empty his treasury, and Smith Castle would have been completed long ago. Did he still need to write his treatise, set up an alchemy workshop, and run the business side of things? In Ryan's mind, the Atlantis immersion potion was nothing short of a breakthrough. Gone were the days when a wizard had to stand guard over a simmering cauldron for hours on end. Instead, you simply submerged all your ingredients at once, let them precipitate naturally, and then handed off the tedious finishing steps to Muggles or apprentice brewers. Under the old method, even a master potioner could supervise only a few batches at a time, or else churn out a massive cauldron of the same concoction, making the process painfully slow. By contrast, the Atlantis technique let savvy wizards at the Academy immerse every ingredient in a single breath, drawing on very little magic power. Think of magical energy as a kind of muscular strength. Depleting it doesn't weaken your limbs directly, but it does sap your overall stamina. Immersion brewing effectively turned that stamina into exercise, like lifting a soda can repeatedly, so the potioner's body absorbed the effort rather than their magic reserves. Given all this, Ryan found himself visiting Atlantis more and more often. The efficiency gains were simply too great to ignore. Whether he still needed to publish his theoretical work or run an alchemy workshop was almost beside the point. With this invention, he could transform the very way potions were made. Ryan's persistence had finally paid off. He'd secured a strategic partnership with Atlantis. In the new alliance, the Atlantean wizards supplied skilled manpower and rare underwater materials, while Ryan lent them his formidable strength and opened up the ancient Smith family conduits, an inheritance he'd long guarded jealously. Truly, it was a generous gesture. The benefits were immediate. Ryan's coffers swelled with gold galleons, Atlantis obtained the resources they craved, and the wider wizarding community enjoyed significantly cheaper potions. Everyone stood to gain, and prosperity seemed assured. By Rig HTS, Ryan no longer needed to maintain such an arrangement. Yet recent developments proved that his Atlantean allies still had much to offer. He discovered they maintained secret channels of communication with Yuecheng, a powerful dealer on the mainland. After a careful mix of firm negotiation and gentle persuasion, Ryan convinced Yuecheng to place a massive order through Atlantis. Now all that remained was to await the arrival of the colossal arbitrary door they'd commissioned. Meanwhile, high above the Atlantean domes, the Moon Temple prepared to welcome Ryan's next visit. There, perched on a marble balcony, was Luna, the enchanting lute player whose eyes gleamed from beneath a silken half-mask. Rumor claimed her music could soothe even the most restless spirit. For the unity and advancement of the wizarding world, Ryan knew he had no choice but to see these plans through. And as the last light of day faded into night, he felt that, at long last, the wheels of his grand design were set firmly in motion. Harry lingered on the edge of the coral archway, reluctant to leave the glowing spires of Atlantis behind. But Ryan's voice cut through his reverie. "Harry, you can't keep juggling two bodies like this without paying a heavy price," he warned. "It's late. Let's go back. You can still make it to dinner at Hogwarts." Harry sighed but nodded. "All right, Ryan. At least I managed to ditch Ron this afternoon, and my other body's back in the dorm. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had any chance to read. He set the leather-bound book down on a smooth, pearlescent pedestal. With a soft crackle of magic, it transformed into a meteor of flickering light and shot upward, dissolving into the star-speckled water above. Hermione edged closer, her eyes wide. "Ryan, how do we get home? And are we still supposed to see the staff of Poseidon?" A nervous tremor betrayed her usual composure. "Going back is easier than you think," Ryan replied, his fingers brushing the amulet at his throat. One moment they stood amid the vast, silent grandeur of the Atlantean palace. The next, the world tilted and vanished. Harry felt a sudden rush of cool air and a brief, exhilarating weightlessness. When he opened his eyes, he was staring at the familiar, arched window of the Ravenclaw dormitory. The scent of parchment and wood polish replaced the brine of the ocean. As he settled back onto his four-poster bed, he could almost pretend he'd never left. Yet the faint pulse of Atlantis and the promise of the staff of Poseidon still hummed at the edge of his thoughts. Chapter 140. The Arrival of the Flying Broom. About a week later, as the throng of owls swooped into the great hall for breakfast, their usual delivery frenzy was interrupted by a single, slender parcel. 6 screech owls clutched it in their talons, bobbing and weaving above the tables until they settled in front of Harry. In their excitement, 2 of the birds flapped too close and sent his strip of bacon tumbling to the floor. Before he could recover his breakfast, a 7th owl appeared, dropping a letter atop the package and flapping off in a whirl of feathers. Harry tore the envelope open at once. The neat handwriting inside read, "Dear Harry, your new Nimbus 2000 has arrived. Because so many students will want to know about it, please keep this under wraps for now. I've arranged for Roger Davies to meet you at the Quidditch pitch tonight at 7 o'clock for your first broom handling lesson. Professor Flitwick." Harry stared at the note, blinking. He'd almost forgotten all about it. Ever since returning from Atlantis a week ago, he'd hardly left the castle except for classes, spending every spare moment poring over the advanced magical theory he'd picked up on his journey. But tonight, his first proper broom lesson was something he couldn't afford to miss. With renewed excitement, he carefully peeled back the wrappings, eager to see the finest broom in the world. Harry wasn't bragging, but he'd mastered every spell he was supposed to learn this semester. The upside, he'd kept a low profile, so Rita Skeeter's sensational exposé was already old news, and the wizarding world had settled back into its usual calm. As he passed the gift-wrapped package to Ron, who stared at it in amazement, Harry remembered the question he'd meant to ask. "By the way, Ryan," he said, "what kind of trauma comes from controlling 2 bodies over a long period?" "Insomnia," Ryan replied with a shrug. "Chronic insomnia." Harry blinked. "That's it?" he asked, utterly deflated. If all it meant was being unable to sleep, maybe he'd have stuck around Atlantis a little longer. Even the prospect of a new broom couldn't lift his spirits now. Ron, however, was too excited to notice Harry's mood. He grabbed Harry's arm. "Come on, mate. Let's find somewhere secluded before charms and open this." Then, quietly ushering a handful of Ravenclaws with him, he slipped off toward the classroom corridor, anything to avoid running into Peeves. They just entered the main hall when Crabbe and Goyle stepped into their path, blocking the stairs. Draco strolled up, plucked the wrapped package from Harry's hands, and gave it a quick once-over. "It's a broomstick. Nothing wrong with it." He tossed it back to Harry, though his brow creased with genuine concern. Ron turned away, pinching his nose in disgust. "Potter, you still look miserable even after getting that broom. What's the matter? Did the Ravenclaws snub you again?" Draco's pale cheeks flared. "Was it that chaser, Henry?" he demanded. Before Harry could ask how Draco knew about Henry, or why he cared, Ron jumped in. "Henry's one of Harry's biggest fans," he said. "You probably wanted to speak with him. Harry's been laying low lately. I'm his friend. I'd notice." He shot Draco a triumphant grin. "If you'd read Rita Skeeter's article, you'd understand why Harry's keeping his distance from you." Draco sneered, folding his arms. "What would you know, Weasley? You're so poor you couldn't afford half a broom handle." Draco sneered. "You're so fixated on your precious Nimbus 2000. And if Rita Skeeter's next article airs all this, it'll be you, not me, left looking foolish. Right, Ron Weasley, with your boundless appetite and hot temper?" Before Ron could fire back, Professor Flitwick materialized at Draco's elbow. Harry inwardly groaned. No matter whose side he picked, he'd be in the wrong. For a split second, he even thought Draco would be less maddening if he were a girl, then chastised himself for the thought. In the shadows, Ryan, who'd been secretly whispering doubts into Harry's ear, shook his head in dismay. Flitwick gave his high-pitched squeak. Now, no quarreling, please. You know about Harry's special circumstances. He turned a kindly gaze on Harry. Harry, what model is your broom? Nimbus 2000, sir, Harry answered. And honestly, Malfoy's just trying to rile us up. Draco shot Ron an insolent look, mouthing insults in silence. Ron's ears flushed a fierce red, almost matching his hair, but he bit back a retort. Bowing stiffly, he said, Excuse us, Professor. We're off. He hustled Harry down the corridor, leaving Draco grinning triumphantly in their wake. Hold up, we still need to return the broom to the common room, Harry reminded Ron, tugging him away from the Quidditch pitch and back through the portrait hole. They climbed the spiraling stairs toward Gryffindor Tower, Draco Malfoy trailing a few paces behind with noticeably uncertain footsteps. Just then, Kate appeared beside Ryan as if she'd stepped out of thin air. Looks like our pale friend is really fretting that Potter's drifting off, she teased. Ryan gave her a calm nod. He is worried, but it's more of a test than genuine fear. Draco's trying to see if Harry's loyalty can be swayed. Ron's friendship, by contrast, is ironclad. He's just a bit reckless. Kate let out a theatrical sigh, flopping to the floor in a stubborn pout. She wouldn't budge until someone coaxed her upright. With a patient smile, Ryan knelt and gently persuaded her to stand. After all, Kate's natural stealth made her vanishing act habitual, but Ryan always had the right touch to bring her back. Once she was upright and placated, Ryan waved her off in Penelope's direction and headed to his own class. Inside the classroom, Harry hunched over his parchment, jotting down every insight the professor offered. Ron, however, fidgeted in his seat, his attention flitting from one corner of the room to the next. That evening in the common room, Ron could think of nothing but Harry's new broomstick nestled beneath his bed. Ever since class ended, he'd been pestering Harry to pay a midnight visit to the Quidditch pitch, just to see how the stands and the twilight kinks in the net looked under moonlight. When he fairly buzzed the idea at Anthony, the newest and most protective of Harry's younger brothers, Anthony immediately agreed. He worried Harry might get shut out of practice by the older chasers, and insisted he'd go along, selling the plan to his twin brothers Michael and Terry. Nearby, Ryan, busy crunching through a melon, looked up at Harry's invite, and good-natured spite twinkling in Harry's eyes, Ryan was hauled into the conspiracy too. Neville greeted the news with a shy nod. Even Hermione, who normally couldn't care less about broomsticks, decided she'd tag along as Ryan went. By dinner, the gang had practically formed a marching band in the Gryffindor dining hall. Harry ate at his usual, leisurely pace. Ron, on the other hand, was an entirely different sight. He wolfed down his shepherd's pie in 2 giant gulping bites, barely tasting it. When dessert finally arrived, the little squad sprang to their feet. They hustled up the spiral staircase, Ron half dragging Harry, half sweeping the others along behind him, each step echoing with the thrill of their midnight adventure. As they reached the portrait hole, Ron paused a moment, a grin spreading across his face. He already had the perfect plan for slipping the broom out of the dorm, no questions asked. And with that, they vanished into the corridors, their laughter trailing after them like a fluting charm. This time, he was the first to solve the eagle-emblazoned ring's riddle at the door. Once inside the dormitory, everyone, except Harry, Ryan, and Hermione, turned to stare at the gleaming package on Harry's bed, the long-awaited Nimbus 2000. Harry shifted awkwardly, eyes fixed on his toes, willing the moments to pass more quickly.